Most civilizations leave descendants, traditions, or memories behind, yet some seem to vanish so completely that only buried walls and broken objects remain. Around 1600 BC, one of the most advanced societies in the ancient Mediterranean was struck by a disaster powerful enough to change its world forever. But the greatest mystery is not what destroyed it. The greatest mystery is what happened afterward. In 1600 BC, an entire civilization was buried alive and nobody knows what came after. Around 1600 BC, one of the most prosperous civilizations in the Mediterranean was living on an island that seemed perfectly placed for success. Crete sat between three continents, surrounded by sea routes that connected distant peoples long before the Age of Empires. Ships moved across the water carrying pottery, metals, textiles, and ideas. Harbours linked communities that might never have met otherwise. To later generations, this island would become known as the heart of the Minoan civilization, a society remembered through its buildings, artworks, and the many questions it left behind. What makes its story unusual is not simply that it flourished. Many civilizations flourished. What makes its story unusual is that after a great disaster struck the region, the path forward became difficult to see. The traces remain, but the transition between what existed before and what came afterward is still not fully understood. To understand why that mystery exists, we must first understand the world that stood before the catastrophe. Crete was not a land of vast rivers like Egypt or Mesopotamia. Its people lived among mountains, valleys, fertile plains, and long stretches of coastline. Communities adapted to local conditions, cultivating crops such as barley, wheat, olives, and grapes. Herds of animals grazed on hillsides. Villages grew into larger settlements over many generations. None of this happened suddenly. The foundations of Minoan society were built through centuries of accumulated knowledge, much as human societies everywhere developed through the slow transfer of experience from one generation to the next. Long before the first large Minoan centers appeared, human beings had already spent thousands of years learning how to cooperate in groups, organize labor, and adapt to changing environments. The people of Crete inherited those abilities from a much older human story stretching back to the earliest migrations of our species. By the beginning of the second millennium BC, that inheritance had helped create a remarkably sophisticated society. Archaeologists have uncovered large complexes at places such as Knossos, Phaistos, Melia, and Zakros. These sites are often called palaces, but the term can be misleading. They were likely not simply homes for rulers. Evidence suggests they served multiple functions at once. They stored food, coordinated trade, housed workshops, and acted as centers of administration. People arrived carrying goods. Craftspeople transformed raw materials into finished products. Records were kept using writing systems that remain only partly understood today. Daily life revolved around networks of exchange that linked communities across the island. The sea played a central role in nearly everything. For the Minoans, water connected rather than separated. Sailors traveled between islands and distant coasts, creating relationships that extended across much of the eastern Mediterranean. Archaeological discoveries reveal contact with Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, and other regions of the Aegean world. Objects moved from place to place, but so did techniques, artistic influences, and practical knowledge. The island's prosperity depended heavily upon these connections. This maritime orientation reflected something deeply familiar in human history. Since prehistoric times, people have followed routes that offered opportunity. Sometimes those routes crossed grasslands. Sometimes they followed rivers. In the Mediterranean, they crossed open water. The same human curiosity and adaptability that once carried small groups into unfamiliar landscapes now supported a civilization linked together by ships and trade. Yet for all that archaeologists have learned, much remains uncertain. The Minoans left behind a script known as Linear A, but it has not been conclusively deciphered. Their buildings survive. Their pottery survives. Their frescoes survive. Their voices do not. We can observe the results of their decisions without always knowing the thoughts that guided them. That silence creates one of the most intriguing aspects of the civilization. It appears close enough to study in detail, yet distant enough to resist complete understanding. Around 1600 BC, Few signs suggested that this long-developed world was approaching a turning point. Settlements remained active, trade continued across the sea, skills and traditions passed from parents to children just as they had for generations. Life moved forward through familiar rhythms. Yet beyond the horizon, on an island shaped by powerful geological forces, changes were already beginning that would leave an enduring mark on the history of the Mediterranean. Among the many features that make the Minoan civilization stand out in the archaeological record, one of the most surprising is something that appears to be missing. Across much of the ancient world, large settlements were often protected by massive defensive walls. Stone fortifications surrounded important cities. Gates controlled movement. Towers watched over approaching roads. These structures reflected a simple reality that many societies understood well. Human communities could prosper, but they could also be threatened by neighboring powers, raiders, or competing states. Yet when archaeologists began studying the major centers of Minoan Crete, they noticed that several of the largest sites lacked the enormous defensive walls that were common elsewhere. This observation has fascinated researchers for more than a century because it raises an important question. Why would a prosperous civilization invest so much effort in constructing large administrative and economic centers, while apparently placing less emphasis on fortifications than many of its contemporaries? The answer is not entirely clear, and scholars continue to debate the details. What can be said with confidence is that the geography of Crete itself may have provided a degree of natural protection. The island was surrounded by water, and dominated by mountain ranges that divided portions of the landscape. Reaching the island required maritime capability. Moving across parts of the interior could be challenging. Geography alone did not make conflict impossible, but it shaped the conditions under which people lived. The sea that connected Crete to distant lands may also have helped shield it from some of the pressures faced by communities located along frequently contested land routes. Another possibility involves the nature of Minoan power itself. Archaeological evidence suggests that the civilization was deeply engaged in trade and maritime activity. Some researchers have proposed that influence at sea may have reduced the perceived need for extensive defensive architecture at certain periods. This idea is sometimes described as maritime dominance, although the exact scale and nature of Minoan control over sea routes remains uncertain. What matters is that their society appears to have been organized differently from many kingdoms that emphasized military fortifications as visible symbols of authority. The absence of giant walls does not mean the absence of security. Settlements can be protected in many ways. Geography, alliances, economic influence, social organization, and local defensive measures can all contribute to stability. Human societies throughout history have developed different solutions to the same problem. The Minoans seem to have followed a path that relied less on monumental fortifications than some neighboring cultures. This difference becomes especially striking when examining sites such as Knossos. The scale of construction is impressive. Buildings expanded over generations into complex arrangements of rooms, corridors, storage areas, courtyards, workshops, and ceremonial spaces. These were not temporary settlements. They represented long-term investments requiring planning, labor, and resources. Their builders expected continuity. They expected future generations to inherit and use what they created. Such expectations are deeply human. Since the earliest agricultural communities emerged thousands of years earlier, people have built structures not only for themselves but also for those who would come after them. A storage room assumes a future harvest. A road assumes future travelers. A large communal building assumes a future community. The architecture of Crete reflects this same confidence in continuity. Looking back from the present, it is easy to imagine the ancient world as a place of constant crisis. The archaeological record tells a more balanced story. Most people spent their lives engaged in ordinary activities. They planted crops, repaired tools, prepared food, raised children, and participated in local traditions. Stability, not catastrophe, formed the background of daily existence. The remarkable buildings of Minoan Crete were products of that stability. They emerged because generations experienced enough continuity to accumulate wealth, knowledge, and organizational capacity. This context matters because it helps explain why the later disaster would leave such a powerful impression on historians and archaeologists. The civilization that occupied Crete was not a fragile society on the verge of collapse. It was a developed and interconnected world that had evolved across centuries. Its settlements reflected confidence rather than desperation. Its architecture suggested long-term planning rather than immediate survival. The people living within these communities could not see the future any more than we can today. They moved through familiar streets, worked in buildings constructed by earlier generations, and participated in traditions that seemed likely to continue. For the moment, the island appeared secure, prosperous, and deeply rooted in the rhythms of Mediterranean life. By the time the centuries leading up to 1600 BC arrived, the civilization centered on Crete had become one of the most prosperous societies in the Mediterranean world. Its influence could be seen not through vast territorial empires or enormous armies, but through movement, exchange, and connection. Goods traveled across the sea in multiple directions. Pottery produced on Crete has been discovered far from the island itself. Foreign materials arrived in return. Ideas crossed the water alongside merchants and sailors. The Mediterranean, which might appear on a map as a collection of separate lands, functioned in many ways as a shared space linking distant communities together. Crete occupied a favourable position within that network, and its prosperity reflected that advantage. Archaeological discoveries reveal a society capable of organising labour on a significant scale. Workshops produced finely crafted objects. Artisans worked with clay, stone, metal, and pigments. Buildings expanded and were renovated over generations. Storage facilities suggest the collection and management of agricultural resources. These activities required planning, coordination, and a degree of social stability that developed over long periods of time. None of these achievements emerged overnight. They represented the accumulated efforts of countless individuals whose names have been lost, but whose work remains visible in the archaeological record. This pattern reflects a broader truth about human history. Major civilizations are rarely the product of a single generation. They emerge from knowledge, passed forward through families, communities, and institutions. Every tool depends on earlier inventions. Every building technique depends on earlier experiments. Every successful harvest depends on lessons learned from previous seasons. The prosperity of Minoan Crete rested upon this same process of accumulation, a process that stretches back through agricultural societies and ultimately to the earliest human communities that learned to cooperate for survival. One of the most striking windows into this world comes from Minoan art. Frescoes discovered at archaeological sites depict scenes from daily life, nature, ceremonial activities, and interactions between people and their environment. Marine animals appear frequently. Fish, dolphins, and other sea life occupy an important place within the artistic record. While interpretations must remain cautious, these images suggest a civilization deeply familiar with the maritime world that surrounded it. The sea was not merely a source of food or transportation. It formed part of the cultural landscape within which people understood their lives. Trade contributed to prosperity, but prosperity itself created new forms of dependence. A society connected to distant regions benefits from those connections, yet it can also become vulnerable to disruptions affecting the wider network. Ships require safe routes. Markets require stability. Communication depends upon predictable conditions. The more integrated a civilization becomes, the more closely its fortunes may be tied to forces extending beyond any single settlement. This principle can be observed throughout human history, from ancient trade systems to modern global economies. The success of Crete was linked to a broader Mediterranean world, and that connection would eventually become important in ways that no one living at the time could have anticipated. Looking across the island before the coming catastrophe, there would have been many signs of continuity. Farmers worked fields as their parents had done. Sailors navigated familiar waters. Craftspeople practiced skills refined over generations. Children learned traditions from older members of their communities. Life moved forward through routines that felt permanent because they had endured for so long. This experience is common throughout human history. Most people do not live with the expectation that their world is about to change dramatically. Stability creates an impression of permanence, even when deeper forces are slowly reshaping the future beyond immediate perception. Around 1600 BC, Few inhabitants of Crete could have known that their civilization would later become associated with one of the most famous mysteries of the ancient world. The buildings stood. The trade networks functioned. The institutions of society remained active. The sea that had brought prosperity continued to connect the island with distant shores. Yet hidden beneath part of that same maritime landscape was a geological system that had been developing for thousands of years. Long before humans arrived in the region, powerful forces beneath the earth had been shaping islands, coastlines, and seafloors. Those forces were still present. They remained invisible to the people living above them, but they were moving steadily toward a moment that would alter the course of Mediterranean history and leave future generations searching for answers among the remains of a world that once seemed secure. To understand why, the later disaster may have had consequences far beyond a single island, it is necessary to look more closely at the web of connections that linked the ancient Mediterranean together. Around 1600 BC, the sea was not an empty space separating civilizations. It was a living network of routes, journeys, exchanges, and relationships. Long before roads connected distant kingdoms on a large scale, water offered one of the fastest ways to move people and goods across considerable distances. For the communities of Crete, the sea functioned almost like a system of pathways stretching in every direction. It carried opportunity, wealth, information, and influence. The prosperity of the Minoan world was closely tied to this maritime environment. Archaeological evidence shows that ships connected Crete with nearby islands, the Greek mainland, the western coast of Anatolia, the Levant, and Egypt. Pottery produced on Crete has been found far beyond the island itself. Likewise, materials originating elsewhere reached Minoan settlements through trade. Copper, tin, precious stones, ivory, and other valuable resources moved through networks that linked many different societies. These exchanges did not simply transport objects. They also transmitted skills, artistic styles, technologies, and ideas. Human beings have always learned from one another when opportunities for contact exist. The sea made such contact possible on a remarkable scale. For people living in the modern world, it can be easy to underestimate how important maritime travel was in ancient times. Looking at a map, distances between islands may appear small. Crossing those distances without modern navigation, engines, or detailed charts required considerable knowledge and experience. Sailors needed to understand winds, currents, coastlines, weather patterns, and seasonal changes. This knowledge was rarely written down. Instead, it was passed directly from one generation to the next. Fathers taught sons. Experienced sailors instructed younger crews. Communities preserved practical information through memory and repetition. In this way, maritime trade depended not only on ships and harbours, but also on human learning accumulated across centuries. This pattern echoes something much older in our species. Long before civilizations emerged, survival depended on the ability to transmit knowledge between generations. Early humans learned where to find food, how to avoid danger, and how to navigate unfamiliar environments. Those lessons allowed communities to expand into new regions and adapt to changing conditions. Thousands of years later, the sailors of the Mediterranean were still relying on the same fundamental human strength, collective memory. Their voyages represented another chapter in the long story of knowledge passed forward through time. The islands scattered across the Aegean Sea played an important role within this network. Rather than acting as isolated points, many served as stepping stones between larger regions. Ships could travel from one island to another, gradually extending the reach of trade and communication. Communities that might otherwise have remained disconnected became linked through repeated contact. Over generations, these connections created a maritime world in which information could spread surprisingly far. A new technique developed in one region might eventually appear hundreds of kilometers away. A style of pottery could become recognizable across multiple coastlines. Trade networks encouraged familiarity between places that would otherwise have remained strangers. Crete occupied a particularly advantageous position within this system. Its location allowed access to multiple directions of travel. Goods arriving from one area could be redistributed elsewhere. This helped transform the island into a center of exchange. The wealth generated through these activities supported construction projects, specialized craftsmanship, and administrative institutions. Prosperity was not created by geography alone, but geography provided opportunities that skilled communities were able to exploit. Yet, every network carries a hidden reality. The more connected a system becomes, the more events in one place can influence distant locations. A disruption affecting a key route may ripple outward through many communities. A failure in one area can create difficulties elsewhere. Ancient people may not have described such processes in modern terms, but they experienced their effects. The success of Minoan Crete depended upon connections extending across the sea. Those connections brought stability and prosperity for generations. They also meant that any major disturbance within the maritime world had the potential to reach far beyond its original source. For the moment, however, the network remained active. Ships continued to cross familiar waters. Merchants continued to exchange goods. Communities remained linked by routes that had developed over many years. The sea appeared dependable, just as it had for generations. Few could have imagined that forces hidden beneath part of this interconnected world were slowly approaching a moment that would test the resilience of every connection they had built. For the people of Crete, the sea was more than a route for merchants or a source of valuable goods. It formed the backdrop of everyday life. Many settlements stood within sight of the water, and even communities farther inland remained connected to a world shaped by maritime movement. The rhythm of life was influenced by changing seasons, prevailing winds, and the opportunities created by coastal access. Unlike modern societies where oceans are often crossed in hours, the people of the Bronze Age experienced the sea directly. Travel required patience. Journeys depended upon weather. Communication moved at the speed of ships. The Mediterranean was not simply a feature of geography. It was an environment that shaped how people understood distance, risk, and possibility. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Minoans developed considerable skill in navigation and seafaring. Although few details survive regarding the exact methods they used, their extensive trade networks indicate a long tradition of maritime knowledge. Such expertise could not be created quickly. It required generations of observation and practice. Sailors learned how coastlines appeared under different conditions. They learned which winds favored travel in particular seasons. They learned how to recognize changes in weather before storms arrived. Much of this knowledge likely existed only in human memory. A young sailor would learn from older crew members, just as earlier generations had done before him. In this way, the sea became a classroom that stretched across centuries. This process reflects one of the defining characteristics of our species. Human beings are unusual not simply because we learn, but because we accumulate learning. Knowledge does not disappear with each generation. Instead, it can be preserved, refined, and expanded. The earliest humans passed along techniques for making tools, finding resources, and surviving in unfamiliar environments. Thousands of years later, Bronze Age sailors were continuing the same tradition. Their ships represented technology, but the true foundation of maritime travel remained human memory. Every successful voyage depended upon lessons inherited from the past. Living near the sea also influenced how communities organized their economies. Fishing contributed to local food supplies, though agriculture remained essential. Coastal settlements gained access to trade opportunities unavailable to more isolated regions. Materials arriving from distant shores could be transformed by local craftspeople and exchanged again through established networks. This circulation of goods encouraged specialization. Some individuals devoted more time to particular skills because trade made it possible to obtain resources from elsewhere. Over generations, this contributed to the increasing complexity visible in Minoan society. Art provides another glimpse into the relationship between people and the maritime world. Frescoes discovered at several sites include images of marine animals, coastal scenes, and activities connected to the sea. Scholars remain cautious when interpreting such evidence, but the frequency of maritime themes suggests a society deeply familiar with its surrounding waters. The sea was not merely a distant feature on the horizon. It occupied a visible and meaningful place within daily experience. Children growing up on Crete would have seen ships arriving and departing. They would have heard stories carried from distant lands. They would have known that beyond the horizon existed other communities connected through travel and exchange. This awareness may have shaped how people understood their place in the world. Human societies often develop according to the environments they inhabit. Communities living on Great Plains experience space differently from those living among mountains. River civilizations organize life around waterways. Island societies develop their own perspectives shaped by isolation and connection occurring at the same time. Crete offered both. The surrounding sea provided protection from some threats while simultaneously creating access to distant regions. It encouraged interaction without eliminating local identity. This balance contributed to the distinctive character of Minoan civilization. Yet dependence on the sea carried unavoidable uncertainties. Storms could interrupt travel. Changing conditions could affect communication and trade. Maritime networks brought opportunities, but they also required resilience. The same waters that connected communities could become barriers when circumstances changed. Throughout human history, environments that provide advantages often introduce vulnerabilities as well. Prosperity and risk frequently develop together. By the centuries before 1600 BC, the people of Crete had become highly skilled at living within this maritime world. Their society was adapted to it. Their economy depended upon it. Their connections extended through it. The sea appeared familiar, reliable, and deeply woven into everyday life. Yet beneath part of that same world, geological processes that operated on timescales far beyond human experience were continuing their slow transformation of the landscape. The people crossing these waters could observe the surface of the sea, but they could not see what was happening beneath it. By the middle of the second millennium BC, the Mediterranean was not a collection of isolated civilizations developing independently from one another. It was becoming something more interconnected. The distances between regions remained vast by the standards of the time, and travel still depended upon weather, geography, and human endurance. Yet archaeological discoveries reveal a surprising degree of contact across large areas. Goods moved between shores. Technologies spread beyond their places of origin. Artistic influences appeared far from where they first emerged. The people who lived around the Mediterranean may not have thought of themselves as participants in a single network, but in practice many of their lives were linked through patterns of exchange that crossed both land and sea. Crete occupied an important position within this developing world. Its location allowed ships to travel between several major regions. To the south lay Egypt, one of the most powerful and enduring civilizations of the ancient world. To the east were the coastal societies of the Levant and the lands beyond them. To the north stretched the islands of the Aegean and the Greek mainland. To the northeast stood Anatolia, a region connected to multiple trade routes. Crete sat among these different spheres of activity, making it a natural meeting point for people, goods, and ideas. Archaeological evidence provides numerous examples of these connections. Objects associated with Minoan craftsmanship have been found in distant locations, while foreign materials and influences appear within Minoan settlements. Such discoveries reveal more than commercial exchange. They demonstrate repeated contact sustained over long periods of time. A single object can travel by chance, but a consistent pattern of distribution suggests enduring relationships. The Mediterranean world of this era functioned through thousands of individual decisions made by sailors, merchants, craftspeople, administrators, and local communities. Together, those decisions created networks larger than any single person could fully comprehend. This process mirrors something deeply rooted in human history. Since the earliest migrations of our species, human beings have formed connections extending beyond immediate family groups. Small communities exchanged resources, shared knowledge, and established relationships with neighboring populations. Over time, these networks expanded. What began as local interaction gradually developed into regional systems and eventually into complex civilizations. The maritime world surrounding Crete represented one expression of this long pattern. Human cooperation had grown from small prehistoric bands into networks linking societies separated by hundreds of kilometers of open water. Information moved through these networks just as surely as physical goods. New techniques in metalworking could spread from one region to another. Architectural ideas could influence distant communities. Artistic styles could be adapted and transformed as they traveled. People did not need modern communication technologies to share knowledge. Repeated contact over generations allowed innovations to move slowly across landscapes and seas. The Mediterranean became a space where cultures remained distinct, while still influencing one another. This interconnectedness brought many advantages. Regions lacking certain resources could obtain them through trade. Communities could access materials unavailable in their local environments. Specialized production became more practical because goods could be exchanged over larger distances. Economic opportunities expanded. Prosperity increased. Yet interconnected systems possess an important characteristic that is often overlooked when times are stable. They can transmit disruptions as well as benefits. A problem affecting one area may influence others connected to it. The stronger the network becomes, the farther those effects can travel. Modern societies experience this reality regularly, but the principle itself is ancient. Bronze Age trade systems were smaller and slower than those of today, yet they were still vulnerable to interruptions. Routes could become unsafe, resources could become difficult to obtain, communication could break down. A significant disturbance in one region might create consequences far beyond its point of origin. For generations, however, the maritime world surrounding Crete appears to have functioned remarkably well. Trade continued. Settlements expanded. Relationships endured. The sea connected communities across enormous distances, creating a level of interaction unusual for its time. To many people living within this system, its basic structure may have seemed permanent. Ships had traveled these routes for years. Networks had survived across generations. The rhythms of exchange appeared reliable. Yet permanence is often an illusion created by familiarity. Human beings naturally assume that the conditions they inherit will continue into the future. History repeatedly demonstrates otherwise. Somewhere beyond the daily concerns of merchants and sailors, geological forces were building toward an event that would test the resilience of the entire maritime world. What happened next would not affect only a single settlement or even a single island. It would send consequences through a network that had taken centuries to develop, leaving future generations to wonder how much of what followed began with a catastrophe few could have imagined. Long before human beings built settlements on Crete, long before ships crossed the Aegean Sea, and long before any civilization emerged in the Mediterranean, powerful geological forces were already shaping the region. The landscapes familiar to ancient sailors were not fixed features of the world. Islands rose, coastlines shifted, mountains formed, and volcanic systems developed over immense spans of time. Human history often feels ancient from our perspective, yet when compared to the processes that create and transform the Earth itself, even the oldest civilizations occupy only a brief moment. One of the most important examples of this contrast can be found on the island known today as Santorini, called Thera in antiquity. To understand the catastrophe associated with the Minoan world, it is first necessary to understand what kind of place Thera was long before disaster entered the story. Thera formed within a geologically active region where the movement of tectonic plates created conditions favorable for volcanic activity. Deep beneath the surface, forces invisible to human observers slowly reshaped the landscape. Molten rock accumulated, pressure changed, and volcanic systems evolved over thousands of years. These processes occurred on timescales far beyond ordinary human experience. A person might live an entire lifetime without witnessing any dramatic sign of change. Generations could come and go while deeper geological forces continued their work unnoticed. This difference in timescale is important because it helps explain why volcanic regions can appear stable for long periods before suddenly changing. By the Bronze Age, Thera was already inhabited. Archaeological evidence shows that people had established communities there and participated in the wider maritime networks of the Aegean world. The island occupied a strategic position along important sea routes. Its residents engaged in trade and maintained connections with neighboring regions, including Crete. Life unfolded according to familiar rhythms. People built homes, stored food, produced goods, and raised families. Like communities elsewhere in the ancient Mediterranean, they organized their lives around practical concerns and expectations shaped by daily experience. The geological history beneath their feet remained largely hidden from view. Human beings are remarkably skilled at adapting to visible challenges. We learn from experience and respond to immediate conditions. Yet some forces operate so slowly that they become difficult to perceive within a single lifetime. The earliest members of our species evolved by responding to changes in weather, landscapes, animal behavior, and resource availability. Those challenges could often be observed directly. Geological systems present a different kind of reality. They may remain quiet for generations before producing events capable of transforming entire regions. The people living on Thera inherited the same human strengths that had allowed our species to survive for thousands of years, but they also shared the same limitation. They could only understand the world through the evidence available to them at the time. Modern scientific research has revealed that volcanic systems often experience long periods of activity and dormancy. Pressure can build beneath the surface gradually. Magma may accumulate in underground chambers. Small changes can occur without immediately producing catastrophic outcomes. Scientists study these processes using instruments and methods unavailable to ancient peoples. Even today, understanding volcanic behavior remains a complex challenge. This perspective reminds us to be cautious when imagining how Bronze Age communities perceived their environment. We should not assume that people living on Thera knew a major eruption was inevitable, nor should we assume complete ignorance. Like many societies living near active geological features throughout history, they may have observed certain natural phenomena without fully understanding their causes. What can be said with confidence is that Thera was not an ordinary island. It existed within a dynamic geological setting shaped by forces operating deep beneath the earth. For centuries, perhaps longer, those forces continued their gradual development, while human communities expanded across the region. Trade routes connected islands. Settlements prospered. Maritime networks linked distant societies together. On the surface, the world appeared stable. The sea remained familiar. The seasons continued their cycle. Daily life followed established patterns. Beneath that appearance of continuity, however, pressure was accumulating within a volcanic system that had been evolving for millennia. The people sailing through the Aegean could not see those changes. They could only see the island itself rising above the water, a familiar landmark within a connected world. Yet hidden beneath that landscape was a process that would eventually produce one of the most significant natural disasters of the ancient Mediterranean. When modern scientists investigate ancient volcanic eruptions, they often search for clues preserved in layers of rock, ash, sediment, and damaged structures. These traces allow researchers to reconstruct events that occurred thousands of years ago, even when no written descriptions survive. The eruption associated with Thera is one of the most intensely studied examples because of its potential impact on the Bronze Age Mediterranean. Yet despite decades of research, one question remains difficult to answer with certainty. What signs, if any, were visible before the eruption itself began? The challenge lies in the nature of the evidence. Geological systems leave traces, but those traces do not always reveal exactly what ancient people experienced. Modern volcanic eruptions sometimes provide warning signals before major activity occurs. Earthquakes may increase in frequency. The ground may shift slightly. Gases can escape from underground systems. Changes may appear in water sources or local environments. Scientists use sophisticated instruments to detect such signals today, but Bronze Age communities relied entirely upon direct observation. Whether the inhabitants of Thera recognized unusual changes before the eruption remains uncertain. What can be said is that geological evidence suggests the volcanic system was undergoing significant internal processes before the catastrophic event that later reshaped the island. One of the strongest possibilities involves earthquakes. The Aegean region is naturally prone to seismic activity because of its tectonic setting. Archaeologists studying the settlement of Akrotiri on Thera have found evidence consistent with earthquake damage occurring before the final phase of the eruption. Some buildings appear to have been affected and repaired. Certain areas show signs that people may have responded to earlier destruction. These observations have led many researchers to conclude that seismic activity likely played an important role during the period leading up to the eruption. Exactly how much time separated these earthquakes from the main eruption remains a subject of ongoing study, but the evidence suggests that the final catastrophe may not have arrived without warning. If earthquakes were occurring, they would have affected everyday life in profound ways. Human beings are highly sensitive to sudden changes in the environment. A strong tremor can transform familiar surroundings into sources of uncertainty within seconds. Walls crack. Objects fall. Routine activities are interrupted. Even communities accustomed to occasional earthquakes recognize when events become unusually severe. For people living on Thera, repeated seismic activity may have introduced growing concern, though we cannot know precisely how they interpreted what they experienced. It is important to avoid placing modern scientific understanding into ancient minds. We know that earthquakes can be associated with volcanic systems. Bronze Age communities did not possess that framework of knowledge. They would have understood unusual events through their own cultural experiences and local traditions. This limitation reminds us of a broader reality throughout human history. Our species has always depended on observation to understand the world, yet observation alone does not automatically reveal underlying causes. Early humans watched the sky long before astronomy existed. People experienced illness long before modern medicine emerged. In the same way, ancient communities could witness earthquakes without understanding the geological processes occurring beneath them. Knowledge develops gradually across generations, and every society interprets events through the information available at the time. Archaeological discoveries at Akrotiri provide another intriguing detail. Unlike some catastrophic sites where large numbers of victims are found, excavations have uncovered remarkably few human remains directly associated with the eruption deposits. Researchers have proposed several possible explanations. One possibility is that significant numbers of people left the area after experiencing warning signs such as earthquakes. Another is that evacuation occurred during periods of escalating activity. The available evidence does not allow definitive conclusions, but it suggests that at least some inhabitants may have had opportunities to respond before the most destructive phase began. This possibility adds an important layer to the story. The disaster may not have arrived as a completely sudden event. There may have been a period during which the island's residents observed unusual conditions and attempted to adapt. Such behavior would be entirely consistent with the long history of human survival. Throughout prehistory and recorded history alike, people have responded to environmental threats by relocating, preparing, or seeking safer conditions whenever warning signs became apparent. As the volcanic system beneath Thera continued to evolve, the signs visible on the surface may have become increasingly difficult to ignore. Earthquakes may have damaged buildings. Familiar routines may have been disrupted. The island that had long served as a thriving centre within the maritime world of the Aegean may have begun to feel less predictable than before. Yet, even if warning signs existed, few could have imagined the scale of what was approaching. The forces building beneath the island had been accumulating for generations. What would follow was not simply another earthquake or another period of instability. It was an event capable of transforming landscapes, altering coastlines, and sending consequences across a connected world that had taken centuries to build, and leave an enduring mark on the history of a civilization whose future remains partly obscured by time. For generations, the people living across the Aegean had experienced a world that seemed stable enough to build upon. Children grew into adults, settlements expanded, trade routes remained active, and knowledge passed steadily from one generation to the next. Human societies depend upon this sense of continuity. We make plans because we expect tomorrow to resemble today in important ways. The inhabitants of Crete, Thera, and neighbouring islands were no different. Their communities had developed within an environment that, despite occasional challenges, appeared predictable enough to support long-term prosperity. Yet beneath the surface of that familiar world, conditions were beginning to change. Modern geology allows scientists to reconstruct part of what was happening inside the volcanic system of Thera. Deep underground, molten rock was moving and accumulating within chambers beneath the island. Pressure was increasing. The landscape visible on the surface revealed only a small fraction of a much larger process unfolding below. Unlike storms, floods, or seasonal changes, volcanic systems often evolve beyond the limits of direct human observation. The most significant developments occur underground, hidden from view. Ancient people could observe consequences, but not the mechanisms producing them. This distinction is important because it helps explain why even intelligent and experienced communities can be surprised by geological events. Human beings evolved to respond to immediate environmental signals. For hundreds of thousands of years, survival depended upon recognizing dangers that could be seen, heard, or otherwise detected directly. Predators, weather changes, resource shortages, and social threats all produced observable clues. Geological systems operate differently. They may remain quiet for decades or centuries while powerful transformations occur beneath the surface. The people of the Bronze Age possessed the same remarkable adaptability that characterizes our species, but they faced limits imposed by the available evidence around them. As pressure continued to build beneath Thera, the island itself may have begun showing increasingly visible signs of instability. Earthquakes likely became part of the experience of daily life. Structures may have required repairs. Familiar places may have appeared less secure than before. Researchers studying archaeological remains at Akrotiri have identified evidence suggesting that some buildings suffered damage before the final eruption sequence. Such findings support the idea that geological unrest was already affecting the settlement. Whether these developments unfolded over weeks, months, or longer remains difficult to determine with precision, but they indicate that the island was entering a period of significant change. Imagine the challenge faced by communities trying to interpret such events. Every generation inherits knowledge from those who came before, yet inherited knowledge is most useful when conditions remain similar to those already experienced. When environments change in unfamiliar ways, people must make decisions without certainty. Throughout human history, societies have repeatedly confronted situations where old experience provided only partial guidance. Climatic shifts, migrations, epidemics, and natural disasters have all forced communities to respond to circumstances that exceeded previous expectations. The growing instability of Thera may have created a similar problem. The signs were becoming more difficult to ignore, but the ultimate outcome remained unknown. Archaeological evidence suggests that the settlement of Akrotiri was not simply frozen in time by the eruption. Some indications point toward efforts to clean debris and repair damage following earlier seismic activity. This detail offers a glimpse into human behavior during periods of uncertainty. When faced with disruption, people often attempt restoration before abandonment. They repair buildings, reorganize resources, and try to preserve continuity. Such responses reflect a deep tendency within our species. Human communities generally seek stability because stability supports survival. The residents of Thera were likely no different. They lived in a world shaped by routines, responsibilities, and expectations that encouraged perseverance even when conditions became difficult. Yet there comes a point when change accelerates beyond what ordinary adaptation can manage. Geological systems do not negotiate with human schedules or social needs. The forces accumulating beneath Thera had been developing over timescales measured not in years but in millennia. Compared with those immense processes, the lifespan of a civilization was brief. The prosperity of Crete, the trade routes of the Aegean, and the settlements scattered across the islands all existed within a landscape ultimately shaped by forces far older than humanity itself. As the volcanic system approached a critical stage, the balance between surface stability and underground pressure was beginning to break down. The familiar world of the Bronze Age Mediterranean still appeared intact from a distance. Ships continued to travel. Communities remained connected. Daily life persisted. Yet beneath one island at the center of that network, a transformation was nearing the point where it could no longer remain hidden. The Earth itself was preparing to release energy on a scale that would permanently alter the landscape and mark the beginning of one of the most consequential disasters in the history of the ancient Mediterranean. At some point before, the Great Eruption reached its most destructive phase. The instability beneath Thera was no longer confined to the hidden world below the surface. The pressure that had been building for generations began expressing itself through events that people could feel directly. The ground moved. Buildings shook. Walls that had stood for years may have cracked. Objects may have fallen from shelves. What had once seemed permanent suddenly revealed itself to be vulnerable. For the people living on the island, these earthquakes were not abstract geological processes. They were immediate experiences that interrupted daily life and challenged assumptions about the reliability of the world around them. Archaeological evidence suggests that seismic activity occurred before the final eruption. Excavations at Akrotiri have revealed signs of damage that appear to predate the thick volcanic deposits that later buried the settlement. Some structures show evidence of repair or cleanup efforts. These findings do not allow researchers to reconstruct every detail of what happened, but they strongly suggest that the eruption was preceded by a period of unrest. The island did not necessarily move from complete calm to catastrophe in a single moment. Instead, there may have been a sequence of events that gradually signaled increasing instability. For human communities, earthquakes create a unique form of uncertainty. A storm can often be seen approaching. Seasonal changes follow familiar patterns. Even floods may provide visible warning signs under certain conditions. Earthquakes are different. They arrive suddenly and offer little opportunity for immediate preparation. One moment the ground feels solid and dependable. The next moment it is moving beneath your feet. This unpredictability explains why earthquakes have left such powerful impressions throughout human history. Ancient societies across the world recorded them in myths, stories, and traditions because they challenged one of the most basic expectations of human existence: the expectation that the earth beneath us will remain still. The people of the Bronze Age were no less sensitive to this experience than modern populations. Although their understanding of geology differed from ours, they possessed the same nervous systems, the same instincts, and the same awareness of danger that characterize human beings today. When the ground shakes unexpectedly, the body responds immediately. Heart rate increases, attention narrows, people search for safety. These reactions are deeply rooted in our evolutionary history. Long before civilization emerged, our ancestors survived by responding quickly to environmental threats. The earthquakes preceding the eruption would have activated those same ancient responses. Across the island, ordinary routines may have been interrupted repeatedly. Buildings that represented years of labor suddenly required attention. Storage areas may have been damaged. Public spaces may have become unsafe. Families may have spent time assessing risks and repairing structures. Even moderate earthquakes can produce significant social effects when they occur repeatedly. The uncertainty created by ongoing tremors can be almost as disruptive as physical damage itself because communities must constantly decide whether conditions are improving or becoming more dangerous. One of the most intriguing aspects of Akrotiri is the relative absence of human remains within the volcanic deposits that buried the settlement. Archaeologists have proposed several explanations, and caution is necessary because the evidence does not provide definitive answers. However, one possibility is that at least some inhabitants left after experiencing the earlier earthquakes and signs of volcanic unrest. If so, the seismic activity may have played an important role in giving people time to react before the most catastrophic phase arrived. This possibility highlights another recurring theme in human history. People are not passive observers of environmental change. When warning signs become visible, communities often attempt to adapt. They relocate, prepare, or seek safer conditions. Such behavior reflects a survival strategy that has accompanied our species since its earliest beginnings. Yet adaptation has limits. Individuals can respond to immediate threats, but they cannot always predict the scale of what is coming. The residents of Thera may have recognized that something unusual was happening. They may have understood that the island was becoming less stable. What they could not have known was how close the volcanic system was to a transformation that would alter the landscape itself. The earthquakes represented more than isolated events. They were symptoms of a deeper process unfolding beneath the island. Each tremor signaled that pressure was continuing to build. The ground that had supported generations of human activity was becoming increasingly unstable. To those experiencing it, the future would have appeared uncertain. To modern researchers looking back through thousands of years, these earthquakes mark the beginning of the final sequence. They were the first visible signs that the long-hidden forces beneath Thera were approaching a moment from which neither the island nor the wider Mediterranean world would emerge unchanged. After the earthquakes came the event for which Thera would be remembered thousands of years later. Modern scientific research indicates that the eruption was among the largest volcanic eruptions known to have occurred during human history in the Mediterranean region. Although many details continue to be studied and debated, the broad outline is widely accepted. A volcanic system that had been accumulating pressure beneath the island eventually released enormous amounts of energy. What followed was not a single brief explosion, but a complex sequence of eruptive phases capable of transforming both the island and the surrounding environment. To the people living in the Bronze Age, the experience would have been unlike anything they had ever witnessed. Human beings are familiar with storms, floods, droughts, and seasonal change because such events occur regularly within the span of ordinary lifetimes. Massive volcanic eruptions belong to a different category. They may occur so infrequently that no living memory exists to prepare a population for what is about to happen. Knowledge passed from parents to children can help communities respond to recurring challenges. It becomes far less useful when confronting an event larger than anything remembered by previous generations. This may have been the situation facing the inhabitants of Thera and the wider Aegean world. As the eruption intensified, ash and volcanic material were thrown high into the atmosphere. The exact appearance of the event can never be reconstructed with complete certainty, but geological evidence indicates that tremendous quantities of material were expelled from the volcanic system. Ash began falling across parts of the surrounding region. The landscape itself was changing. Areas that had once been familiar became increasingly difficult to recognize. What had been an inhabited island was being reshaped by forces operating on a scale far beyond ordinary human experience. Modern volcanologists study such eruptions because they reveal the immense power stored beneath the Earth's surface. Beneath stable landscapes, geological energy can accumulate over long periods. Most of the time, that energy remains hidden. When released during a major eruption, however, the results can alter ecosystems, coastlines, and human communities in a matter of hours or days. The eruption of Thera serves as one of the clearest examples of this reality in the ancient Mediterranean. It reminds us that human history unfolds within a natural world, whose largest processes are not controlled by human plans, ambitions, or institutions. For the people living across the region, the eruption would have disrupted more than the physical environment. Visibility may have been reduced by ash. Travel routes could have become hazardous. Communities dependent on maritime movement may have found familiar conditions suddenly transformed. The sea that had connected settlements for generations was now part of a landscape undergoing rapid change. Even communities located far from the center of the eruption may have experienced uncertainty as information traveled slowly through the networks linking the Mediterranean world together. Throughout human history, communication has often lagged behind events. People hear fragments of news, incomplete reports, and second-hand accounts during a major natural disaster. Uncertainty itself becomes part of the experience. The eruption also highlights a recurring pattern in the story of our species. Human civilizations often appear powerful when viewed from within. Large buildings, extensive trade networks, and complex institutions create an impression of permanence. Yet even the most sophisticated societies remain dependent on environmental conditions they do not fully control. This dependence has existed since the earliest members of our species first adapted to changing climates and landscapes. Agriculture, trade, and urban development increase human capabilities, but they do not eliminate vulnerability. The eruption of Thera occurred within a world that had spent centuries building prosperity through cooperation and exchange. In only a short period of time, geological forces demonstrated how fragile those achievements could become. Scientists continue to investigate the precise sequence of events associated with the eruption. Questions remain regarding chronology, scale, and regional impacts. Such uncertainties are normal when studying events that occurred thousands of years ago. What is not in doubt is that the eruption dramatically altered Thera itself. Large portions of the island were transformed. Volcanic deposits buried settlements. The landscape visible today bears the marks of those ancient processes. The island that emerged after the eruption was not the same island that had existed before it. For the people of the Bronze Age, this transformation would have represented more than environmental change. It would have signaled the collapse of familiar expectations about the world around them. The ground had already begun to shake. Now the earth was opening with a force capable of reshaping an entire landscape. Yet the full consequences of the eruption were still unfolding. Beyond the volcanic ash and destruction on Thera itself, another threat was moving outward through the interconnected maritime world that had helped make the Minoan civilization prosperous in the first place. As the eruption continued, its effects extended far beyond the island where it began. A volcanic eruption of this scale does not remain confined to a single location. Ash, dust, and fine particles can be carried by winds across great distances, reaching places that may never see the volcano itself. For the interconnected communities of the Bronze Age Mediterranean, This meant that the disaster unfolding on Thera had the potential to become a regional event rather than merely a local tragedy. The sea routes that had linked settlements together for generations now existed beneath skies altered by one of the most powerful natural events of the age. Modern researchers study layers of volcanic material preserved in different locations to understand how widely the eruption's effects spread. Ash deposits associated with the eruption have been identified across parts of the eastern Mediterranean, providing evidence that material from Thera travelled far beyond the island. The exact distribution varied according to wind patterns and local conditions, but the broader picture is clear. The eruption affected a region much larger than the volcano itself. Communities separated by hundreds of kilometers may have experienced at least some consequences of the event, even if those consequences differed greatly from place to place. To people living at the time, the most immediate changes would likely have been sensory. The appearance of the sky could have changed. Fine ash may have settled across landscapes. Air quality may have been affected in some areas. The familiar relationship between land, sea, and horizon may have become less certain. Human beings rely heavily on visual information to understand their surroundings. When the sky's below self changes in unexpected ways, it can create a profound sense of unease. Throughout history, unusual atmospheric conditions have often attracted attention because they alter one of the most constant features of daily experience. For maritime societies, visibility carried practical importance as well. Sailors depended upon their ability to observe coastlines, navigate waters, and respond to changing conditions. Any disruption affecting these abilities could influence travel and communication. The sea had long functioned as a highway connecting communities. If environmental conditions made voyages more difficult or uncertain, the effects could ripple through trade networks already dependent on regular movement. This does not mean that all maritime activity immediately stopped. Human societies are resilient and often continue functioning under difficult circumstances. However, disruptions affecting transportation and communication can create challenges that accumulate over time. Ashfall may also have affected agriculture in some regions. The degree of impact varied according to location and the amount of material deposited. Modern volcanic eruptions demonstrate that ash can influence crops, water supplies, and local ecosystems. Researchers continue to examine how such effects may have unfolded following the eruption of Thera. As with many aspects of the event, caution is necessary because the evidence does not always allow precise conclusions. What can be said is that communities across the region were interacting with an environment that had suddenly become less predictable than before. This broader environmental disruption highlights a recurring theme in human history. Human beings have always depended upon systems larger than themselves. Early hunter-gatherers depended on ecosystems. Agricultural societies depended on climate, soil, and seasonal cycles. Maritime civilizations depended on routes connecting distant communities. Prosperity often emerges when these systems function reliably. Difficulties arise when those systems are disrupted. The eruption of Thera reminds us that even highly successful societies remain connected to natural processes operating beyond human control. The people living around the Mediterranean could build ships, organize trade, and construct impressive settlements, but they could not prevent volcanic ash from entering the atmosphere or changing conditions across the region. Another important aspect of the story involves information itself. In the modern world, news of a disaster can spread globally within minutes. Bronze Age communities experienced a very different reality. Information traveled at the speed of people and ships. Reports moved gradually from one location to another. Some accounts would have been incomplete. Others may have been inaccurate. Communities attempting to understand what was happening often had access only to fragments of knowledge. This uncertainty may have been nearly as significant as the physical effects themselves. People knew that something extraordinary had occurred, yet understanding the full scale of the event would have taken time. As ash continued to move through the atmosphere and settle across parts of the Mediterranean world, the eruption's immediate phase was drawing toward its conclusion. The island of Thera had been transformed. Settlements lay buried beneath volcanic deposits. Familiar landscapes had disappeared. Yet the story was not ending. The eruption had altered far more than a single island. It had introduced stress into a connected maritime world whose prosperity depended on stability. The question facing future generations would not simply be what happened during the eruption. The deeper question would be what happened afterward. when communities across the region were forced to adapt to a world that no longer looked exactly as it had before. Among all the places affected by the eruption of Thera, none provides a clearer window into the event than the ancient settlement known today as Akrotiri. Buried beneath layers of volcanic material for thousands of years, the site remained hidden from view until modern excavations gradually revealed what had been preserved below. For archaeologists, Akrotiri became one of the most important discoveries in the Mediterranean because it offered something exceptionally rare. Instead of finding only scattered artifacts or isolated ruins, researchers encountered an entire community frozen within a particular moment of history. Streets, buildings, storage areas, workshops, and household objects survived beneath the deposits left by the eruption. The result was not a complete picture of ancient life, but it was far more detailed than what is usually available for settlements of comparable age. Before the eruption, Akrotiri had been a thriving Bronze Age community connected to the wider maritime world of the Aegean. Its location made it an active participant in the networks of trade and communication that linked islands and coastal societies together. Archaeological evidence reveals a settlement with multi-story buildings, sophisticated construction techniques, drainage systems, and impressive wall paintings. These discoveries challenge modern assumptions about what life was like more than 3,000 years ago. The people who lived there were not isolated villagers existing on the margins of history. They belonged to a developed society capable of organizing labor, managing resources, and maintaining long-distance connections with neighboring regions. Walking through the excavated remains today, researchers can trace streets that once carried daily traffic. Rooms still contain evidence of storage vessels and household activities. Fragments of frescoes reveal scenes painted by artists whose names are unknown, but whose work survives across millennia. Every preserved structure represents countless ordinary moments that would otherwise have vanished completely. Meals were prepared, goods were stored, conversations took place. Children grew up and learned skills from older generations. The physical remains remind us that history is not composed solely of major events. It is also built from ordinary lives unfolding within larger social systems. This perspective connects Akrotiri to a much longer human story. Since the earliest settlements emerged after the development of agriculture, communities have created spaces designed to support daily life. Homes, workshops, storage areas, and communal buildings appear again and again throughout human history because they reflect recurring needs shared across cultures and time periods. The people of Akrotiri inherited traditions that stretch back through thousands of years of human adaptation. Like countless generations before them, they organized their environment in ways that helped communities survive and prosper. Yet what makes Akrotiri extraordinary is not only what survived, but also how it survived. The volcanic deposits that buried the settlement eventually protected many of its remains from later disturbance. In a paradox familiar to archaeologists, the same disaster that destroyed the community also contributed to the preservation of valuable evidence. Structures collapsed, but many were shielded from erosion and later human activity. Organic materials that would normally disappear sometimes left traces. Architectural details remained in place. Objects stayed close to where they had originally been used. This preservation allows researchers to study aspects of Bronze Age life that might otherwise remain unknown. One of the most intriguing features of Akrotiri involves what archaeologists have not found. Despite extensive excavation, relatively few human remains have been discovered within the volcanic deposits. This absence has generated considerable discussion among researchers. Several explanations have been proposed, and caution remains essential because the evidence does not provide definitive answers. However, many scholars believe that at least part of the population may have left before the most destructive phase of the eruption. Earlier earthquakes and signs of volcanic unrest could have provided warning that conditions were becoming dangerous. If this interpretation is correct, Akrotiri tells a story not only of destruction, but also of human response. The settlement may preserve evidence of people recognizing danger and attempting to escape it. Even so, departure did not guarantee safety from the broader consequences unfolding across the region. The world to which survivors may have fled was itself being transformed by the eruption. Trade routes were disrupted, environmental conditions were changing, networks that had supported prosperity for generations were under increasing strain. Akrotiri therefore stands at a unique point in the story. It marks the place where the physical impact of the eruption can be observed most clearly, while also raising deeper questions about the fate of the people who once lived there. The buildings remain, the streets remain, the artworks remain, yet the lives that animated the settlement largely disappear from view, leaving future generations to reconstruct their story from the silent evidence preserved beneath layers of volcanic ash. When archaeologists excavate an ancient settlement, they rarely uncover a complete story. More often, they find fragments: a broken vessel, a damaged wall, a scattered collection of tools, or traces of a structure long since destroyed. The challenge is to combine these fragments into a careful reconstruction without claiming more than the evidence can support. Akrotiri is unusual because the quantity and quality of preservation provide a richer collection of clues than many other Bronze Age sites. Even so, every conclusion must remain grounded in what was actually discovered. The site is valuable not because it answers every question, but because it offers a remarkably detailed record of a world that would otherwise be almost invisible. One of the most striking discoveries involves the architecture itself. Buildings at Akrotiri demonstrate a level of sophistication that surprised many early researchers. Some structures rose several stories high, rooms were organized for different purposes. Storage spaces, living areas, workshops, and communal sections reveal a settlement that had developed beyond the scale of a simple village. Construction techniques suggest planning, experience, and access to skilled labor. These buildings were designed for long-term use. Their existence reflects generations of accumulated knowledge regarding materials, engineering, and organization. Archaeologists have also uncovered extensive evidence of storage and economic activity. Large vessels used for holding agricultural products appear throughout the site. Such containers indicate systems for collecting, preserving, and distributing resources. Societies become more complex when they can reliably store food and manage supplies across seasons. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout human history. From the earliest agricultural communities onward, the ability to produce surpluses allowed populations to grow, labor to become specialized, and settlements to expand. Akrotiri fits within this broader story of human development. The settlement reflects a community supported by organizational structures capable of sustaining more than immediate survival. The wall paintings, often called frescoes, are among the most famous discoveries from the site. These artworks provide rare visual evidence from the Bronze Age Aegean world. They depict people, animals, plants, landscapes, and activities connected to daily life and ceremonial practices. Some scenes include ships moving across the sea. Others portray natural environments with remarkable attention to detail. Researchers study these images carefully because they offer insights unavailable through architecture alone. Art cannot reveal every aspect of society, but it can preserve elements of how people chose to represent themselves and their surroundings. Through these paintings, we gain a glimpse of a community that invested time, resources, and skill into visual expression. Another important category of evidence comes from everyday objects. Pottery, tools, furniture remains, containers, and household items reveal practical aspects of life that written records often ignore. Ancient history is sometimes told through kings, wars, and monumental events, yet most human experience occurs at a much smaller scale. Meals are prepared, objects are repaired, goods are stored, skills are taught. The artifacts recovered from Akrotiri remind us that the Bronze Age was populated by ordinary people engaged in familiar activities. Although separated from us by thousands of years, they navigated many of the same basic realities of human existence. The discoveries also reveal connections extending beyond the island itself. Materials and artistic influences indicate participation in wider networks linking the Aegean, Crete, and other regions of the Mediterranean. Akrotiri was not isolated. Its inhabitants were part of a connected world shaped by exchange and movement. This observation reinforces a theme that appears throughout the history of our species. Human beings rarely thrive alone. Cooperation, communication, and interaction with neighboring groups have repeatedly contributed to social development. The prosperity visible at Akrotiri emerged within a broader system of relationships extending across the sea. Perhaps the most valuable lesson provided by the archaeological evidence is methodological rather than historical. Akrotiri demonstrates how much can be learned from physical remains while also revealing the limits of interpretation. Researchers can identify buildings, analyze materials, and reconstruct certain activities with considerable confidence. Yet many personal details remain unknown. We do not know the names of most inhabitants. We cannot fully recover their conversations, hopes, fears, or beliefs. The archaeological record preserves traces of lives, not complete biographies. This distinction is essential for maintaining historical accuracy. The strength of Akrotiri lies not in providing certainty about everything, but in offering an unusually detailed foundation upon which careful conclusions can be built. As excavation continued over the decades, the site revealed an increasingly vivid picture of a prosperous Bronze Age community. Streets, homes, storage systems, workshops, and artworks all contributed pieces to that picture. Yet alongside every discovery came another realization. Some of the most important questions were not about what had been found. They concerned what remained absent. The evidence preserved beneath the volcanic deposits was remarkable, but the gaps within that evidence would prove equally significant when researchers attempted to understand what happened to the people themselves. What archaeologists discover at a site often attracts the most attention. Buildings, tools, artwork, and preserved landscapes provide tangible connections to the past. Yet sometimes, the most important clues come not from what is present, but from what is absent. Akrotiri offers one of the clearest examples of this principle. The settlement contains streets, homes, storage vessels, workshops, and remarkable wall paintings. It preserves evidence of a thriving community that participated in the broader world of the Bronze Age Mediterranean. At the same time, researchers have long been struck by something that appears surprisingly rare within the volcanic deposits. Compared with what might be expected from a settlement of its size, relatively few human remains have been found. This absence has become one of the most discussed aspects of the site because it raises questions about what happened in the period immediately before the eruption reached its most destructive stage. The first point to understand is that absence is not evidence of certainty. Archaeology is a discipline built upon incomplete information. The fact that something has not been found does not automatically prove that it never existed. Excavations cover only portions of ancient sites. Preservation conditions vary. Some evidence disappears through natural processes over time. Responsible interpretation therefore requires caution. Researchers cannot simply fill gaps with speculation. Instead, they must evaluate multiple possibilities and determine which explanations are most consistent with the available evidence. Even with those limitations, many archaeologists consider it plausible that a significant number of Akrotiri's inhabitants left before the final phase of the eruption. Earlier earthquakes may have damaged buildings and signaled growing instability. Signs of volcanic unrest may have encouraged people to seek safety elsewhere. Some evidence suggests that parts of the settlement were cleaned after earthquake damage occurred. This detail is important because it indicates human activity following at least some of the earlier disturbances. The community was not necessarily overwhelmed without warning. There may have been a period during which people recognized danger and attempted to respond. If evacuation occurred, it would represent a familiar pattern within human history. Our species has survived countless environmental challenges, partly because people rarely remain passive when threats become visible. Communities move away from floods, seek shelter during storms, and relocate when local conditions become too dangerous. Such responses do not guarantee survival, but they reflect a deeply rooted adaptive behavior. Long before civilizations emerged, early humans survived changing climates and shifting landscapes by remaining flexible. The inhabitants of Akrotiri inherited the same evolutionary capacity for adaptation, yet leaving the settlement would not have solved every problem. Even if many residents escaped the immediate effects of the eruption, they entered a wider world that was itself experiencing disruption. Trade networks were under strain. Maritime routes may have become less reliable. Communities throughout parts of the eastern Mediterranean were confronting environmental changes whose full consequences were still unfolding. Survival after a disaster often depends not only on escaping the initial event, but also on adapting to the conditions that follow. Another absence at Akrotiri involves written explanations. Unlike some later civilizations, the people of the site left no surviving account describing the eruption itself. Archaeologists must reconstruct events through physical evidence rather than eyewitness testimony. This limitation creates a fundamental difference between prehistoric archaeology and later historical periods. Researchers can identify volcanic deposits, damaged structures, and patterns of abandonment. They cannot directly recover human thoughts regarding what was happening. The emotional experience of the disaster remains largely beyond our reach. This challenge reflects a broader reality regarding the ancient past. Most human beings who have ever lived left no written record of their existence. Their lives must be understood indirectly through the traces they left behind. Archaeology excels at revealing environments, technologies, economies, and patterns of behavior. Individual experiences are often much harder to recover. Akrotiri preserves a community with extraordinary detail, yet even here significant silences remain. We can see where people lived, we can study objects they used, we can examine artwork they created, but many personal stories disappeared long ago. These absences are not failures of the archaeological record. They are part of what makes the site so compelling. Every discovery at Akrotiri is accompanied by unanswered questions. The preserved buildings reveal a prosperous settlement. The lack of large numbers of human remains suggests that at least some inhabitants may have escaped. The absence of written testimony leaves crucial details uncertain. Together, these gaps remind us that history is rarely a complete narrative. It is often a careful reconstruction built from fragments of evidence, supported by what can be demonstrated and restrained by what cannot. The result is a picture that remains both clear and incomplete. We can say with confidence that a flourishing Bronze Age community existed on Thera. We can say that it was buried by one of the most significant volcanic eruptions of the ancient Mediterranean. We can say that many aspects of daily life were preserved beneath volcanic deposits. Beyond those conclusions, uncertainty begins to grow, and it is within that uncertainty that one of the most important questions of the entire story emerges. If the people of Thera escaped the island, what happened when the consequences of the eruption spread outward across the sea toward the civilization most closely connected to them? The eruption of Thera transformed the island itself, but one of the most important questions concerns what happened beyond the immediate area of the volcano. For many years, researchers have investigated whether the eruption generated powerful tsunami waves capable of affecting coastlines throughout parts of the eastern Mediterranean. This question matters because the Minoan civilization was deeply connected to the sea. Its settlements, trade routes, and economic networks depended upon maritime activity. If large tsunami waves reached coastal communities linked to Crete, the consequences could have extended far beyond the destruction visible on Thera itself. Understanding this possibility requires careful attention to both geological evidence and the limits of what can be known with certainty. A tsunami differs from ordinary waves created by wind. Instead of affecting only the surface of the water, a tsunami involves the movement of enormous volumes of seawater. Such waves can be generated by earthquakes, underwater landslides, volcanic activity, or combinations of these processes. In the case of Thera, scientists believe that multiple mechanisms may have contributed. The eruption itself was exceptionally large. Parts of the volcanic structure collapsed. Massive amounts of material entered the surrounding sea. Each of these processes had the potential to disturb the water on a significant scale. Modern geological research indicates that tsunami generation is a plausible consequence of the eruption, although researchers continue to refine their understanding of the exact sequence of events. Evidence for ancient tsunamis is often difficult to interpret because coastlines change over time. Waves leave traces, but those traces can be altered by erosion, sediment deposition, later human activity, and natural environmental processes. Despite these challenges, scientists have identified deposits in some locations that are consistent with the effects of powerful marine inundation associated with the period of the Thera eruption. These findings do not answer every question, but they support the view that unusually large waves likely affected portions of the surrounding region. For people living along the coast, a tsunami would have represented a very different kind of danger from volcanic ash or earthquakes. Earthquakes are felt directly. Ash can be seen falling from the sky. A tsunami often arrives from the sea itself. Communities that relied upon harbours, fishing grounds, and maritime trade could suddenly find those same waters transformed into a source of destruction. Ships, anchored near shore would be vulnerable. Coastal facilities might be damaged. Areas normally associated with commerce and communication could become zones of danger within a short period of time. Human history contains many examples of societies adapting to the opportunities offered by coastlines. The earliest migrations of our species often followed rivers, lakes, and coastal environments where resources were relatively abundant. Water supported transportation, food gathering, and communication. Over thousands of years, communities repeatedly settled near shorelines because the advantages were considerable. Yet those advantages were always accompanied by risks. Storms, floods, changing sea levels, and rare catastrophic events have shaped coastal societies throughout history. The people of the Bronze Age Mediterranean inherited this same relationship with the sea. Their prosperity depended upon it, but their vulnerability was linked to it as well. The Minoan world was particularly exposed because maritime activity occupied such a central role within its economy. Goods moved across the sea. Information moved across the sea. Relationships between communities depended upon the sea. A major disruption affecting coastal infrastructure, therefore, had the potential to create consequences extending far beyond immediate physical damage. Even if a settlement survived, its connections to neighbouring regions might be weakened. Harbours could require repairs, maritime routes could become temporarily unusable, economic systems built upon reliable movement might experience increasing strain. Researchers continue to debate the precise scale of tsunami impacts on Crete itself. Some coastal archaeological sites show evidence consistent with major marine disturbances. Other locations provide less clear indications. This variation is not surprising. Tsunami effects are rarely distributed evenly across a region. Local geography influences how waves behave when they reach shore. Certain bays, inlets, and coastal configurations can amplify impacts, while other areas may experience less severe consequences. As a result, different communities may have faced very different experiences during the same event. What remains important is the broader pattern emerging from geological and archaeological research. The eruption of Thera was not simply an isolated volcanic disaster confined to one island. It had the potential to affect the wider maritime system upon which much of the eastern Mediterranean depended. The sea that had connected communities for centuries may also have carried some of the eruption's most destructive consequences outward across the region. For a civilization whose strength rested heavily upon maritime connections, such disturbances would have introduced new challenges at precisely the moment when stability was already under pressure. The question was no longer whether Thera had been transformed. The question was how deeply the shock of that transformation reached into the interconnected world surrounding it. If powerful tsunami waves did reach parts of Crete and neighbouring regions, one of the most vulnerable elements of the Minoan world would have been its coastal infrastructure. The prosperity of the civilization depended not only on ships and sailors, but also on the facilities that allowed maritime trade to function. Harbours, storage areas, docking locations, coastal settlements, and transportation networks connected inland communities to the sea. These places formed the physical foundation of a system that had taken generations to develop. Understanding how such locations may have been affected is important because the consequences of a major disaster are often measured not only by immediate destruction, but also by the disruption of the connections that sustain a society. Over time, archaeological evidence suggests that some coastal areas of Crete experienced significant disturbances during the period associated with the Thera eruption. Researchers continue to debate the exact nature and extent of these impacts, but there is broad agreement that parts of the coastline were exposed to unusual forces. Geological deposits, damaged structures, and changes in settlement patterns have all been examined as possible indicators of tsunami activity. The evidence is complex and does not support a single simple narrative. Different locations appear to have experienced different outcomes depending on geography, elevation, and proximity to vulnerable shorelines. This variation is consistent with what scientists observe in modern tsunami events, where neighbouring areas can experience dramatically different levels of damage. To appreciate the significance of coastal disruption, it helps to consider how maritime systems function. A ship crossing the sea is only one part of a much larger network. Goods must be loaded and unloaded. Resources must be stored. People require places to gather information, exchange products, and organize future voyages. Harbors serve as points where multiple activities converge. Damage to such locations can interrupt economic processes extending far beyond the immediate area. A single damaged harbor may affect merchants, craftspeople, farmers, sailors, and communities connected through trade. The impact spreads through relationships rather than remaining confined to a specific location. This principle appears repeatedly throughout human history. Networks derive strength from connection, but connection also creates pathways through which disruption can travel. The people of the Bronze Age understood this reality through experience, even if they described it differently than modern economists or historians. Their prosperity depended upon reliable movement across the sea. When that movement became uncertain, the effects could accumulate gradually. Some researchers have suggested that coastal facilities associated with the Minoan world may have required substantial recovery efforts following the eruption. Even if communities survived, rebuilding infrastructure would have demanded labor, resources, and time. Ships can be repaired or replaced. Buildings can be reconstructed. Storage systems can be restored. Yet every recovery effort requires energy that might otherwise have been directed toward expansion, trade, or other productive activities. Natural disasters often create long-term consequences precisely because reconstruction competes with ordinary economic functions. Human societies are resilient, but resilience itself carries costs. Looking deeper into the past, this pattern connects with a fundamental aspect of human development. Since the earliest migrations of our species, survival has depended upon maintaining access to resources and communication routes. Hunter-gatherer groups relied on pathways connecting seasonal environments. Agricultural communities depended on routes linking fields, water sources, and settlements. Maritime civilizations extended these connections across seas. In every case, the ability to move people, goods, and information played a crucial role in social stability. Damage to transportation networks therefore affects more than physical infrastructure. It challenges the mechanisms through which societies coordinate collective activity. Another factor complicates the picture. The Minoan civilization was not concentrated in a single city or a single harbor. It consisted of multiple communities distributed across Crete and connected to a wider maritime world. This diversity may have provided a degree of resilience. Some locations could suffer more heavily while others remained functional. Networks often survive local damage by relying on alternative routes and centers of activity. Such flexibility has helped human societies recover from disruptions throughout history. For this reason, many historians are cautious about attributing the decline of the Minoan civilization solely to the immediate effects of the eruption or potential tsunamis. The evidence suggests a more complex situation in which natural disaster created pressures that interacted with existing social and economic systems. Even so, the possibility of widespread coastal damage remains significant. The sea had long served as the source of Minoan strength. It connected communities, facilitated trade, and supported prosperity across generations. If tsunami waves disrupted key points within that network, the consequences would have reached far beyond the shoreline itself. The damage would not simply be measured in destroyed structures. It would be measured in interrupted relationships, delayed communication, weakened economic activity, and growing uncertainty about the future. Such effects are often less visible than the dramatic moment of a disaster, yet they can shape the trajectory of a civilization long after the waves themselves have disappeared. The question now becomes whether these disruptions were temporary challenges that the Minoans could overcome, or whether they marked the beginning of deeper changes within a society already facing the consequences of one of the most powerful natural events in the ancient Mediterranean. The immediate effects of a natural disaster are often the easiest to imagine. Buildings collapse, landscapes change, lives are disrupted within hours or days. Yet historians and archaeologists frequently pay equal attention to what happens afterward. The long-term consequences of a catastrophe can sometimes prove more important than the event itself. In the case of the Minoan civilization, one of the central questions is whether the eruption of Thera and its associated effects disrupted the economic networks upon which Minoan prosperity depended. The evidence does not support a simple answer, but it does suggest that a society built upon maritime connections may have faced serious challenges in the years that followed. Before the eruption, Crete occupied a favourable position within the interconnected world of the eastern Mediterranean. Ships linked the island to neighboring regions. Goods moved between communities. Resources unavailable in one area could be obtained through exchange with another. These connections encouraged specialization, allowing some individuals and communities to focus on particular activities because broader networks helped supply their needs. Such systems create prosperity by increasing efficiency and expanding opportunities. At the same time, they also create dependencies. The more a society relies upon interconnected networks, the more vulnerable it becomes when those networks experience disruption. This principle applies not only to ancient civilizations but to human societies throughout history. A community that depends entirely on local resources may possess fewer opportunities for growth, but is less affected by distant events. A highly connected society gains many advantages while also exposing itself to risks originating far beyond its immediate environment. The Minoan world appears to have belonged firmly within the second category. Its success was linked to maritime movement, exchange, and communication across considerable distances. If coastal infrastructure suffered damage, if shipping routes became less reliable, or if partner communities elsewhere faced their own difficulties, the cumulative effects could gradually weaken the system that had supported centuries of prosperity. Archaeologists have long debated the extent of these impacts. Some scholars emphasize the destructive potential of the eruption and its aftermath. Others argue that the Minoan civilization demonstrated considerable resilience and continued functioning for generations after the event. The available evidence supports caution. Major civilizations rarely disappear overnight. More often, they experience a series of pressures that interact over time. Economic disruption, environmental stress, political change, and external influences may combine in ways that are difficult to separate clearly in the archaeological record. The eruption of Thera appears to fit within this broader pattern. It may have introduced significant challenges without necessarily causing immediate collapse. One reason this question remains important is that economic systems are often invisible compared with monuments or disasters. People can easily observe a collapsed building. It is much harder to observe a weakened trade relationship, a disrupted supply chain, or a gradual decline in commercial activity. Yet these less visible processes can have profound consequences. A harbour damaged by a tsunami may eventually be rebuilt, but repeated interruptions to trade can alter patterns of wealth and influence across entire regions. Communities that once prospered through exchange may find themselves adapting to new realities. Over time, such adjustments can reshape social and political structures. This dynamic reflects a recurring feature of human history. Since the earliest agricultural societies emerged, prosperity has depended upon the successful management of resources across space and time. Communities store food for future use. Networks move materials between regions. Institutions coordinate collective activities. The complexity of these systems allows civilizations to achieve remarkable accomplishments, but complexity also introduces fragility. The larger and more interconnected a system becomes, the more pathways exist through which disruption can spread. Human beings have repeatedly confronted this challenge, from prehistoric exchange networks to modern global economies. The Minoans were participating in an ancient version of the same reality. Another important consideration involves psychology and perception. Disasters do not affect only physical infrastructure. They influence how people understand risk and stability. Communities that experience major environmental shocks may alter their behavior even after immediate recovery becomes possible. Merchants may choose different routes. Settlements may shift priorities. Leaders may redirect resources towards security or reconstruction. Such responses can shape the future as strongly as physical damage itself. Unfortunately, these kinds of decisions rarely leave clear archaeological traces. Researchers must infer them indirectly through patterns visible in the material record. What emerges from the available evidence is not the image of a civilization instantly erased by a single catastrophe. Instead, a more complex picture appears. The eruption of Thera likely introduced substantial stress into a maritime system that had developed over centuries. Coastal disruption, environmental effects, and interruptions to trade may have weakened important foundations of Minoan prosperity. The civilization survived the initial shock, but survival and recovery are not identical processes. A society can continue existing while gradually becoming more vulnerable to future challenges. As the decades passed after the eruption, new forces were beginning to emerge elsewhere in the Aegean world. Those forces would eventually play a crucial role in determining what came next for Crete and for a civilization whose future was becoming increasingly uncertain. The story of the Minoan civilization becomes even more complex when we look beyond the eruption itself and examine what was happening elsewhere in the Aegean world. Natural disasters rarely operate in isolation from human history. Societies experiencing environmental challenges must also respond to political changes, economic competition, demographic shifts, and interactions with neighboring cultures. While Crete was dealing with the consequences of the Thera eruption and its aftermath, another civilization on the Greek mainland was becoming increasingly important. Modern scholars know these people as the Mycenaeans. Their rise would eventually transform the balance of power in the Aegean and contribute to one of the most significant transitions of the Bronze Age Mediterranean. The Mycenaeans were not strangers arriving suddenly from an unknown land. They had been developing on the Greek mainland for centuries. Archaeological evidence reveals communities that gradually increased in complexity, wealth, and organizational capacity. Settlements expanded. Trade networks grew. Elite groups accumulated resources and influence. Over time, powerful centers emerged in various parts of mainland Greece. These developments occurred within the same interconnected world that linked Crete, the islands of the Aegean, Anatolia, and the eastern Mediterranean. The rise of the Mycenaeans, therefore, formed part of a broader regional process rather than an isolated event. One reason the Mycenaeans attract such attention is that they left behind evidence of a society organized differently from the Minoan world. Archaeological discoveries suggest a stronger emphasis on fortifications, military capabilities, and centralized authority. Massive defensive walls surrounded some major centers. Elite tombs contained valuable goods demonstrating access to considerable wealth. Administrative systems developed to manage resources and coordinate activities across substantial territories. These features do not mean that Mycenaean society was defined solely by warfare. Like all civilizations, it included farmers, craftspeople, traders, families, and religious practices. Nevertheless, the archaeological record indicates a political landscape that differed in important ways from that of Bronze Age Crete. The relationship between the Minoans and the Mycenaeans remains one of the most fascinating subjects in Aegean archaeology. Evidence points toward extensive contact between the two cultures. Goods moved between regions, artistic influences crossed the sea, technologies and ideas circulated through existing networks of exchange. The Mycenaeans clearly learned from aspects of Minoan civilization. At the same time, they developed their own distinctive traditions and institutions. This pattern reflects a recurring theme throughout human history. Civilizations rarely exist in complete isolation. They influence one another through trade, migration, diplomacy, imitation, and competition. Cultural exchange often produces new forms rather than simple copies of existing models. Looking further back into the human past, this process has deep roots. Since the earliest migrations of our species, communities have learned from neighboring groups. Innovations spread when people interact. Techniques developed in one location appear elsewhere. Languages, customs, and technologies evolve through contact. The relationship between the Minoans and Mycenaeans belongs to this long history of human exchange. What makes it particularly significant is that it occurred during a period when the balance of influence within the Aegean world was beginning to change. Archaeological evidence indicates that Mycenaean power increased during the centuries following the Thera eruption. Meanwhile, signs of change become visible within Crete itself. Historians continue to debate exactly how these developments should be interpreted. The evidence does not support a simple narrative in which one event directly caused another. Instead, researchers generally view the period as a time of overlapping processes. Environmental disruptions, economic adjustments, political developments, and shifting regional relationships may all have contributed to changing circumstances. This complexity is important because history rarely unfolds through a single cause. Large transformations usually emerge from multiple factors interacting over time. One of the most intriguing pieces of evidence comes from writing. The script known as Linear B, associated with the Mycenaeans, eventually appears on Crete. This development suggests that Mycenaean influence extended to the island in meaningful ways. The implications remain a subject of study, but the evidence points toward a world in which mainland powers were becoming increasingly significant. The question is not whether the Minoans disappeared immediately after the eruption. The archaeological record clearly indicates continued activity on Crete. The more important question concerns how the eruption may have altered the balance between existing powers and emerging rivals. A civilization weakened by disruption does not necessarily collapse at once. Sometimes it simply becomes less capable of resisting future pressures. As decades passed, the Mycenaeans were expanding their reach within a region already affected by environmental upheaval. The maritime world that had once been dominated by Minoan influence was becoming more competitive. New centers of power were emerging. Old patterns were changing. The future of Crete would increasingly be shaped not only by the memory of a volcanic catastrophe, but also by the ambitions of neighboring societies whose influence was continuing to grow across the Aegean world. For generations, the Minoan civilization occupied a remarkably influential position within the Aegean world. Its location, maritime experience, and extensive trade connections allowed Crete to participate in networks that stretched across large portions of the eastern Mediterranean. Goods, ideas, artistic styles, and technologies moved through these routes, helping to create a prosperous society whose influence could be felt far beyond the island itself. Yet history rarely allows any position of dominance to remain unchanged forever. Even successful civilizations must continuously adapt to shifting circumstances. By the centuries following the eruption of Thera, signs were beginning to appear that the balance of influence within the Aegean was no longer what it had once been. Understanding this transition requires looking not only at dramatic events, but also at gradual changes that unfolded across generations. Human societies often experience transformation slowly enough that those living through it may not immediately recognize its significance. A single year can seem familiar to the one before it. Trade continues. Harvests are gathered. Ships travel established routes. Daily life retains many of its routines. Yet beneath this appearance of continuity, deeper shifts may be taking place. Economic influence can move from one region to another. Political power can become concentrated in new centers. Emerging competitors can strengthen their position while older systems struggle to maintain previous advantages. The relationship between Crete and the growing Mycenaean world appears to reflect this broader pattern. Archaeological evidence suggests that mainland centers became increasingly prosperous and organized during this period. Wealth accumulated in important Mycenaean settlements. Long-distance exchange continued to expand. Political institutions developed greater capacity to manage resources and coordinate activity. These changes did not necessarily occur because of weakness on Crete alone. Rather, they reflected the growth of alternative centers capable of competing more effectively within the interconnected landscape of the Late Bronze Age. The rise of one power and the relative decline of another often occur simultaneously, because both are shaped by the same regional environment. The sea remained central to this story. Maritime routes connected the islands, the mainland, Anatolia, and regions farther east. Control over these connections did not belong permanently to any single civilization. Instead, influence depended upon the ability to maintain economic relationships, organize resources, and respond to changing conditions. If the eruption of Thera and its aftermath placed additional strain upon Minoan networks, even modest reductions in efficiency or stability could have created opportunities for competitors. Human history repeatedly demonstrates that advantages need not disappear completely for balances of power to change. Sometimes it is enough for one society to grow slightly stronger while another faces increasing challenges. This process connects to a much older feature of human evolution. Throughout prehistoric times, groups adapted to changing environments by shifting their strategies. Some communities expanded into new territories. Others developed innovations that improved survival or productivity. Success often depended less on absolute strength than on the ability to adjust when circumstances changed. The same principle can apply to civilizations. A society that flourishes under one set of conditions may struggle when those conditions evolve. Another society, better positioned to take advantage of new opportunities, may rise in relative importance. Archaeological evidence from Crete suggests continuity alongside change. Many aspects of Minoan culture persisted. Communities remained active. Traditions continued. The island did not suddenly become empty, yet signs of increasing Mycenaean influence become visible in multiple forms. Material culture, administrative practices, and broader political developments all point toward a world in which mainland powers were becoming more deeply involved in the affairs of Crete. Historians continue to debate exactly how these changes unfolded. Some emphasize gradual integration, others highlight episodes of conflict or political intervention. What remains clear is that the relationship between the two regions evolved significantly over time. One reason this transition matters is that it challenges a common misconception about the end of civilizations. Popular narratives often imagine sudden collapses in which one society disappears and another immediately replaces it. The archaeological record usually reveals something more complicated. Cultural traditions overlap, institutions adapt, populations continue living in familiar landscapes even as political authority changes. The transformation of influence within the Aegean appears to fit this pattern. The story is not simply about disappearance. It is about reorganization, adaptation, and the emergence of new structures within an already interconnected world. As Mycenaean influence expanded, the sea that had once carried Minoan prosperity increasingly connected Crete to powers whose ambitions and institutions were shaped elsewhere. The island remained an important part of the Mediterranean landscape, but it was no longer occupying exactly the same position it had held during earlier centuries. The consequences of environmental disruption, economic adjustment, and political competition were beginning to converge. The question facing historians is not whether change occurred. The evidence for change is substantial. The deeper question is how far that change eventually went, and whether the civilization that emerged afterward could still be described as truly Minoan, in the same sense as the world that had existed before the eruption of Thera. One of the strongest reasons historians believe that the balance of power shifted after the great age of Minoan influence comes from evidence found directly on Crete itself. Archaeology does not preserve speeches announcing political change. It rarely provides a single dramatic moment when one civilization clearly ends and another begins. Instead, researchers look for patterns appearing across settlements, administrative systems, material culture, and written records. On Crete, several of those patterns suggest that Mycenaean influence became increasingly important during the centuries following the eruption of Thera. These changes did not happen overnight. They emerged gradually, leaving traces that archaeologists continue to study today. Among the most significant pieces of evidence is the appearance of Linear B, a writing system associated with the Mycenaean world. Earlier Minoan administration had relied upon a script known as Linear A. Although many examples of Linear A have survived, scholars have not yet fully deciphered the language it recorded. Linear B, however, was successfully deciphered during the 20th century and is now understood to represent an early form of Greek. The presence of Linear B on Crete indicates more than a simple change in writing style. Administrative systems are closely connected to political authority. When a new script becomes associated with record-keeping, resource management, and official activity, it often reflects deeper transformations occurring within society. This does not mean that Minoan culture instantly disappeared when Linear B appeared. Cultural change rarely follows such simple boundaries. People continue practicing traditions, speaking languages, and maintaining local customs, even while political structures evolve around them. Nevertheless, the growing use of a script associated with mainland powers suggests that important developments were underway. The island was increasingly connected to institutions whose roots lay beyond Crete itself. Archaeological evidence from major centres such as Knossos also contributes to this picture. Knossos remained one of the most important sites in the Aegean long after the eruption of Thera. Yet the material record indicates changes in administration and organisation that many scholars interpret as signs of Mycenaean involvement. Debate continues regarding the exact sequence of events and the nature of political control. Researchers do not agree on every detail. What they broadly agree upon is that the later history of Crete cannot be understood without considering the growing influence of mainland Greece. Looking at the broader history of humanity, such transitions are remarkably common. Powerful societies often absorb influences from neighbouring cultures while simultaneously influencing others in return. Political authority shifts. economic relationships evolve. Languages spread across regions, yet populations themselves frequently remain in place. The people living through these changes may experience continuity in many aspects of daily life, even as larger structures around them are transformed. This distinction is important because it helps explain why the end of a civilization is often difficult to define precisely. Is a civilization defined by its political leadership, its language, its cultural traditions, or the people who inhabit its territory? Different answers can lead historians toward different interpretations. The situation on Crete illustrates this challenge clearly. Minoan artistic traditions did not vanish immediately. Architectural practices continued to influence later communities. Religious customs may have persisted in modified forms. Elements of Minoan culture remained visible, even as evidence for Mycenaean administration increased. Rather than a sudden replacement, the archaeological record suggests a period of overlap and interaction. Human societies are often shaped less by complete disappearance than by gradual blending, adaptation, and reorganization. This process reflects patterns that extend deep into our evolutionary past. For tens of thousands of years, human groups have encountered neighboring populations, exchanged knowledge, adopted useful innovations, and incorporated outside influences into existing traditions. Cultural boundaries are rarely fixed. They shift over time as people respond to changing circumstances. The transition from a predominantly Minoan world toward one increasingly influenced by Mycenaean institutions belongs to this larger story of human adaptation and interaction. Yet an important question remains unresolved. How much of this transformation can be connected to the eruption of Thera? Historians continue to debate the answer. Some view the eruption as a major turning point that weakened existing systems and created opportunities for emerging powers. Others emphasize longer-term trends already underway before the disaster occurred. Most modern researchers recognize that both perspectives may contain elements of truth. Natural disasters often accelerate processes that are already developing, rather than creating entirely new conditions on their own. Whatever the exact balance of causes, the evidence from Crete points toward a world undergoing profound change. The island that had once stood at the center of an influential maritime civilization was becoming part of a different political landscape. New forms of administration appeared, new centers of power gained influence. The cultural legacy of the Minoans survived, but the structures that had supported their dominance were no longer the same. By this stage of the story, the question is no longer whether change occurred. The evidence makes that clear. The deeper mystery is whether the civilization buried beneath ash and transformed by history truly ended, or whether parts of it continued living on in forms that later generations scarcely recognized as descendants of the world that came before. When people hear that a civilization was buried alive, it is natural to imagine a sudden ending. A city disappears beneath ash. The coastline is struck by waves, buildings fall silent. The mind wants a clear boundary between before and after, as if history can be divided by a single disaster into two clean halves. Yet the story of the Minoan world resists that kind of simplicity. The eruption of Thera was real, destructive, and deeply significant, but the civilization connected to Crete did not simply vanish in one moment. Archaeology points instead toward a slower and more difficult transformation, in which some things ended, some things survived, and some things changed so gradually that the border between survival and disappearance remains hard to draw. This distinction matters because civilizations are not single objects that can be broken all at once. They are made of people, habits, skills, beliefs, trade routes, buildings, memories, and systems of authority. A palace can burn while a farming village continues. A script can disappear while pottery styles remain. Political control can shift while families keep living on the same land. The people of Crete did not stop being human witnesses to their own world, simply because later historians struggle to name what came after. They continued to eat, work, repair, trade, remember, and adapt, as human beings have done since the earliest communities learned to survive across changing landscapes. Long before the Bronze Age, our species endured by carrying useful knowledge through disruption. A flood might change a riverbank. A dry season might force movement. A lost hunting ground might require new routes. Survival rarely meant preserving everything unchanged. More often, It meant keeping enough of life intact for another generation to continue. This older human pattern helps us understand why the Minoan story after Thera cannot be reduced to disappearance alone. The catastrophe may have damaged networks, weakened coastal systems, and altered the balance of power, but human communities are rarely erased in the same way that buildings can be buried. On Crete, evidence shows continued occupation after the eruption. Major centres remained active for some time. Craft traditions did not vanish immediately. Religious and artistic elements associated with earlier Minoan culture continue to influence later forms. These traces suggest that the world after the disaster still carried pieces of the world before it. Yet continuity does not mean unchanged survival. A society can continue physically while losing the structure that once made it dominant. Its people may remain, but its old system of power may no longer guide the region. This is why the question becomes so delicate. Did the Minoan civilization disappear, or did it become something else? The answer depends on what we mean by civilization. If we mean the people living on Crete, then they clearly did not all vanish. If we mean the older maritime order that had once placed Crete at the center of Aegean influence, then that world was slowly fading. If we mean the language, administration, and political system that supported earlier Minoan power, then the evidence points towards serious change, especially as Mycenaean influence became more visible. The buried houses of Akrotiri, the damaged coastlines, the ash layers, and the later administrative records all speak in fragments. Together they do not tell a simple story of instant death, they suggest a quieter and more unsettling truth. Sometimes a civilization can survive long enough to become unrecognizable, leaving future generations unsure whether they are looking at an ending, a continuation, or the slow birth of another world. After a disaster, survival is often quieter than destruction. It does not always appear in dramatic scenes or clear announcements. It appears in a repaired wall, a familiar shape painted again on pottery, a ritual object placed in a remembered way, or a settlement that continues to be occupied after a moment of crisis has passed. When archaeologists study Crete after the eruption of Thera, they do not find a world that simply stops. Instead, they find traces of continuation mixed with traces of change. This is one of the reasons the Minoan story remains so difficult to summarize. The catastrophe damaged the wider Aegean world, but it did not erase every habit, every skill, or every community connected to the older civilization. Many parts of life are more durable than political power. Farmers can keep planting fields even when trade becomes unstable. Craftspeople can continue shaping clay even when distant markets weaken. Families can continue teaching children how to prepare food, repair tools, care for animals, and understand local landscapes. These everyday forms of knowledge are often the deepest roots of a society. They reach farther back than palaces, scripts, or official systems. Since the earliest periods of human history, communities have survived by preserving practical knowledge across generations. A group that remembered where water could be found, when plants ripened, or how to make a useful tool could endure changes that might have destroyed less flexible ways of life. On Crete, after the eruption, this older human pattern helps explain why continuity remained possible. The island itself was still inhabited, its agricultural zones still mattered, its coastlines, though vulnerable to disturbance, still offered access to the sea. Its communities still possessed generations of accumulated skill. Archaeological evidence shows that Minoan cultural traditions did not disappear immediately. Artistic motifs, religious symbols, architectural habits, and craft practices continued in various forms. Some of these continuities are difficult to interpret with certainty because material culture can persist even when political authority changes. A pot made in an older style does not prove that an entire social system remained unchanged. A religious image reused later does not reveal exactly how people understood it. Still, these traces show that the world before the catastrophe did not vanish cleanly. It left patterns that could be carried, adapted, and reshaped. This is especially important when thinking about identity. Modern viewers often want ancient peoples to fit into fixed categories: Minoan, Mycenaean, Egyptian, Greek. But people living through history do not always experience identity in such neat terms. A family may continue local customs while accepting new rulers. A craftsperson may use inherited techniques while producing goods for a changed economy. A community may remember older sacred places while participating in newer systems of administration. Continuity and transformation can occupy the same household, the same workshop, and even the same object. On Crete, the continued use of certain spaces and traditions suggests that the people who lived after the eruption were not simply replacing the past, they were living inside its remains. Yet survival was not the same as recovery to former strength. The older Minoan maritime system appears to have lost some of its earlier dominance. The political and administrative landscape gradually shifted. Mycenaean influence became stronger, and so new forms of record-keeping and control appeared. These changes show that something important had altered, even if many people continued to live, work, and remember. A civilization can persist in fragments while losing the structure that once held those fragments together. This is one of the quiet truths of history. What continues may be just as revealing as what disappears. The Minoan world after Thera was not an empty silence. It was a landscape of surviving habits, damaged networks, inherited memories, and changing power. The people who came after did not step into a blank world. They stepped into a world still filled with traces of those who had built before them, and those traces would shape what followed in ways that remain only partly visible to us today. What begins to disappear after a catastrophe is not always the most visible thing. Walls can remain standing, fields can still be planted, people can continue living in familiar places. From a distance, life may appear to go on. Yet beneath that surface, older systems may begin to lose their strength. This seems to be one of the most important ways to understand the Minoan world after the eruption of Thera. The civilization was not erased in a single moment, but some of the structures that had once made it powerful began to weaken, shift, or pass into forms that are difficult to recognize. The first thing that appears to have faded was the older pattern of Minoan dominance across the sea. For generations, Crete had been one of the great centers of Aegean exchange. Its ships, workshops, storage systems, and administrative centers helped support a maritime order that connected islands and coastlines across the eastern Mediterranean. After the eruption and its wider effects, that position seems to have become less secure. Coastal damage, possible tsunami impacts, ashfall, and trade disruption may not have destroyed every settlement, but they could have reduced the efficiency of the network that had sustained prosperity. A trade system does not need to collapse completely in order to lose its former power. It only needs to become less reliable, less central, or less able to respond when other societies are growing stronger. Another thing that began to change was administration. Earlier Minoan systems had used scripts that remained partly beyond modern understanding, especially Linear A. Later, Linear B appeared on Crete, a script associated with Mycenaean Greek administration. This does not mean that every local custom disappeared at once, but it does show that the way power was recorded and organized had changed. Writing is never just marks on clay. It belongs to institutions, storehouses, officials, economies, and systems of control. When a new administrative language appears in a major center, it suggests that authority itself is being reshaped. The older voice of the Minoan world was becoming harder to hear, not because all its people vanished, but because the systems that preserved official memory were changing. This is a familiar pattern in the longer story of humanity. Since the earliest communities began passing knowledge across generations, survival depended on memory, but memory has many layers. Practical memory can survive in farming, craft, food, and ritual. Political memory can disappear much more easily when institutions fail or are replaced. A family may remember how to work the land, even after rulers change. A craftsperson may keep using inherited techniques, even when the old palace economy no longer functions. But the names, laws, records, and official stories of a civilization can fade when the institutions that protected them are broken. On Crete, the disappearance was therefore uneven. The people did not vanish in a simple biological sense. The land was not emptied, but older forms of leadership, economic coordination, and written identity seem to have lost their central place. Artistic traditions also changed. Minoan motifs continued, but they did not remain untouched. Some were absorbed into new cultural settings. Some were repeated without the same original context. Some became part of a broader Aegean style shaped increasingly by Mycenaean power. This kind of transformation is quiet, but it matters deeply. When symbols survive after their original world has changed, they can become echoes rather than living voices. The dolphin, the bull, the flowing marine forms, the painted walls, and the delicate objects may still remind us of Minoan creativity, yet they no longer prove that the old society remained intact. By the time Mycenaean influence became more visible, the question was no longer whether anything Minoan survived. Much did survive. The harder question was what had stopped guiding the future. A civilization can disappear not because every person dies, but because its older way of organizing time, power, memory, and connection no longer leads the world that comes after it. The mystery of the Minoan world after Thera exists because the evidence is strong in some places and fragile in others. We can see the volcanic deposits. We can study buried streets at Akrotiri. We can trace changes in pottery, architecture, writing, and trade. Yet the most important human questions remain difficult to answer. Where did the people of Thera go, if many of them left before the final destruction? How many communities on Crete were directly affected by the eruption, the ash, or the sea? How quickly did trade recover? How much political authority remained in Minoan hands after the disaster? These questions matter because they stand between the dramatic event and the uncertain world that came afterward. A catastrophe can be visible in the ground, but its social consequences are often harder to measure. One broken harbour may leave traces. A weakened economy may leave only patterns that become clear slowly across many sites. A change in leadership may appear through writing, storage systems, or imported objects, but rarely through a simple statement carved for future historians. This is why the story cannot be told as a clean line from eruption to disappearance. The ancient world did not leave that kind of evidence. Instead, it left fragments, and those fragments require patience. Archaeology is careful work because the past does not speak in complete sentences. It speaks through damaged walls, buried jars, ash layers, bones, tools, tablets, and gaps. Some gaps are accidental. Some exist because materials decayed. Some exist because excavation is incomplete. Some exist because the people themselves did not write in ways that later generations can fully read. The undeciphered nature of Linear A is one of the largest silences in this story. If it could be read securely, it might reveal more about administration, language, names, goods, and perhaps even social organization. But without that key, much of the older Minoan voice remains closed to us. This limitation connects the Minoans to a much deeper human problem. Most people who ever lived did not leave readable records. The earliest human communities survived, adapted, raised children, moved through landscapes, and passed on knowledge without writing anything at all. Their lives shaped the future, yet their personal voices are gone. The people of Crete and Thera lived much later than those first communities, but they still share that silence in important ways. Their buildings remain more clearly than their words. Their objects remain more clearly than their decisions. Their survival strategies remain partly hidden behind the physical traces they left behind. Another unanswered question concerns timing. The eruption of Thera is often placed around the middle of the 2nd millennium BC, but exact dating has been debated because different scientific and archaeological methods do not always align perfectly. This matters because chronology affects interpretation. If the eruption occurred earlier than some cultural changes on Crete, then it may have created long-term stress rather than immediate collapse. If certain changes were already underway before the eruption, then the disaster may have accelerated existing trends. Time is not a minor detail here. It determines whether we understand Thera as the main cause, one cause among several, or a powerful event inside a broader transformation. There is also the question of human movement. If some people escaped Akrotiri, did they settle elsewhere in the Aegean? Did they join communities on Crete? Did their memories survive in stories that later changed beyond recognition? At present, evidence cannot follow them with certainty. This is one of the quietest losses in the whole narrative. A population can survive physically and still disappear historically if later records do not preserve their path. The mystery, then, is not a lack of evidence. It is the uneven nature of evidence. We know enough to see that something enormous happened, but not enough to close the space between disaster and aftermath. That space is where the question of the title remains alive. A civilization was struck, buried in places, weakened in others, and transformed over time. But the exact human road from that catastrophe to the world that followed remains partly hidden beneath ash, sea, silence, and the long erosion of memory. Because the evidence is incomplete, scholars have offered different explanations for what happened to the Minoan world after the eruption of Thera. These explanations are not simply guesses. They are attempts to organize the available evidence into patterns that make historical sense. Yet each explanation has limits, because no single piece of evidence can carry the whole story. One view emphasizes the eruption as a major turning point. According to this interpretation, the volcanic disaster damaged coastal settlements, disrupted maritime trade, weakened economic systems, and made Crete less able to maintain its earlier influence. In this view, Thera did not need to destroy every Minoan community directly. It only needed to weaken the networks that had allowed Crete to remain powerful. A civilization built around ships, harbours, storage systems, and long-distance exchange could continue living while slowly losing the structure that had made it dominant. Another view places more weight on internal and regional changes that may have been developing before the eruption. From this perspective, the Aegean world was already becoming more competitive. Mainland centres were growing stronger. Mycenaean communities were accumulating wealth, building fortified centres, expanding trade, and developing administrative systems of their own. If this process was already underway, then the eruption may have been important without being the only cause of Minoan decline. It may have accelerated a shift that had deeper roots. This interpretation is attractive because history rarely turns on one event alone. Human societies are shaped by overlapping pressures, some visible and sudden, others slow and difficult to measure. A third explanation focuses on political transformation rather than collapse. In this view, Crete did not simply fall into emptiness. Instead, its institutions changed as Mycenaean influence expanded. The appearance of Linear B on Crete supports the idea that mainland Greek administration eventually became important on the island. This does not mean that every local tradition disappeared. It suggests that authority, record-keeping, and perhaps control over resources were reorganized. The old Minoan world may have survived culturally while losing political independence. This kind of change is common in human history. A population may continue living in the same places while its rulers, language of administration, and wider alliances change around it. A fourth possibility gives more attention to environmental and economic stress after the eruption. Ashfall, possible tsunami damage, changes to agriculture, damaged harbours, and disrupted routes may have created long-term pressure. These pressures may not have produced immediate collapse, but they could have made recovery uneven. Some communities may have adapted well, others may have struggled. The effects of a disaster are rarely equal across a landscape. Geography, wealth, social organisation, and access to help all shape recovery. Since the earliest human communities, survival after crisis has depended not only on strength before the event, but also on flexibility afterward. The same principle may apply to Bronze Age Crete. There is also a more cautious position, which argues that we should not connect the eruption too directly to later Minoan decline. Some researchers warn that the gap between the disaster and later political changes may be too complex to treat as a simple cause and effect chain. The eruption was enormous, but Crete remained inhabited and active afterward. Major centres continued for some time. Cultural traditions persisted. If we exaggerate the disaster's effects, we risk turning a real historical event into a neat story that the evidence does not fully support. This caution is important for maintaining honesty. The title asks what came after, but the honest answer is not a single theory. It is a set of possibilities held against the limits of the record. The most balanced view may be that the eruption of Thera created severe stress within a world already changing. It damaged or disrupted parts of the maritime system, while Mycenaean power grew in the same broader region. Older Minoan traditions continued, but the political and economic framework around them shifted. What came after was neither total disappearance nor simple survival. It was a transformation so gradual and uneven that the ancient people who lived through it may not have seen it as the end of one civilization. Even though later generations struggled to decide what name to give the world that followed, The limits of evidence are not empty spaces. They are the boundaries that keep history honest. When archaeologists study the Minoan world after the eruption of Thera, they are not facing a total absence of information. They have ash layers, ruined buildings, pottery sequences, administrative tablets, coastal deposits, damaged settlements, imported goods, and changes in material culture. These traces are real, and they allow careful reconstruction, yet they do not allow every question to be answered. The past survives unevenly. Some materials endure for thousands of years, while others vanish quickly. Stone walls may remain. Clay tablets may survive if they are baked by fire. Pottery can last in fragments across immense spans of time. But wood decays, cloth disappears, spoken words leave no direct trace. Memories vanish unless they are preserved in forms that later generations can read. The Minoan case is difficult because some of the most important evidence belongs to categories that are fragile or silent. The older Minoan script, Linear A, has not been securely deciphered. This means that many administrative records cannot yet speak clearly to us. We may see marks on clay, but the full meaning of those marks remains beyond reach. That silence matters deeply. If we could read them with confidence, they might tell us more about goods, places, officials, offerings, names, or systems of authority. Without that understanding, researchers must rely more heavily on material patterns. This creates a careful but incomplete picture. It is like seeing the shape of a house from its foundations while never hearing the voices of those who lived inside. Dating also creates limits. The eruption of Thera occurred in the 2nd millennium BC, but the precise alignment between scientific dating and archaeological chronology has been debated. This is not a small problem. If an event happens before a major cultural shift, it may be understood as a cause, a stress, or a background condition. If it happens closer to the shift, the interpretation may change. Time controls the relationship between events. Human history is built from sequences, and when the sequence is uncertain, explanations must remain careful. This is why responsible historians avoid turning the eruption into a simple answer for everything that followed. The physical scale of the disaster is clear, but the social chain of consequences is harder to measure. Another limit concerns the human body itself. The relative absence of human remains at Akrotiri suggests that many inhabitants may have left before the final burial, but it does not tell us where they went, how many survived, or what happened to them afterward. A person can escape a disaster and disappear from the record the next day. A family can move to another island and leave no name behind. A community can be absorbed into another population without producing an obvious archaeological signature. Since the earliest journeys of our species, human groups have moved, merged, adapted, and vanished into larger patterns. The people of Thera and Crete were not outside that deeper human story. Their movements may have shaped later communities, even if we cannot follow each individual path. Evidence also changes depending on where we look. A coastal settlement may preserve signs of marine disturbance. An inland site may show continuity. One palace centre may reveal administrative transformation, while a village may preserve older habits longer. No single location can represent the whole civilization. This is one of the most important cautions in archaeology. The Minoan world was not one building, one harbour, or one island settlement. It was a network of communities spread across landscapes and connected through sea routes. A disaster could strike unevenly, leaving some places damaged, some changed, and others still functioning. When future generations try to understand what came after, they must assemble many local histories into one larger pattern without forcing them into a false simplicity. The evidence, therefore, points toward transformation, but not toward a single neat ending. It shows survival, damage, adaptation, outside influence, and unanswered questions existing together. This may feel unsatisfying, but it is closer to the truth than a dramatic certainty the record cannot support. The Minoan world after Thera is not hidden because nothing remains. It is hidden because what remains is scattered, partial, and silent in precisely the places where human curiosity asks the deepest questions. A tradition can break without making a sound. No wall has to fall at the exact moment it happens. No witness has to record it. Sometimes the break appears only much later, When archaeologists notice that a familiar pattern has weakened, that a symbol no longer appears in the same way, or that an old system of record-keeping has been replaced by another. In the Minoan story after Thera, this kind of break is especially important. The eruption buried Akrotiri and disturbed the wider Aegean world, but the deeper loss may have involved the slow weakening of habits that had once connected generations. Traditions are not decorative details. They are the memory of a society made visible through repeated actions. A way of building, a way of painting, a way of storing grain, a way of marking clay, a way of approaching sacred spaces. All of these can carry knowledge from the past into the present. Since the earliest human communities, survival has depended on this transfer. Long before writing existed, people taught one another where to find water, how to shape tools, when animals moved, and how to recognize danger in the landscape. Tradition was one of the first bridges between generations. It allowed human beings to live longer than individual memory. On Crete, older Minoan traditions had accumulated across centuries. They appeared in architecture, in marine imagery, in ritual objects, in administrative practices, and in the arrangement of large centers where storage, craft, ceremony, and exchange met one another. These traditions did not disappear immediately after the eruption. Many continued in altered forms, yet continuation can conceal weakness. A symbol may remain visible while the institution that gave it meaning has already changed. A building style may continue while the authority that once organized it has shifted. A ritual object may survive while the language used around it is no longer preserved. This is why the break in tradition is difficult to see. It did not arrive as a clean cut. It arrived as a fading of connection. One of the clearest examples comes from writing. Earlier Minoan administration used Linear A, a script still not securely understood today. Later, Linear B, associated with Mycenaean Greek administration, appeared on Crete. This change matters because writing systems belong to systems of power and memory. They record goods, people, offerings, places, and obligations. When the script of administration changes, the official voice of a society changes with it. The old language of authority becomes quieter. The people may remain, and many customs may continue, but the structure through which the society remembers itself begins to transform. The same process may have affected artistic and religious traditions. Minoan imagery continued to influence later Aegean culture, but influence is not the same as uninterrupted life. When later people adopt older symbols, they may preserve them, reinterpret them, or detach them from their original context. The past can survive as an echo, beautiful and meaningful, yet no longer anchored to the same world that created it. This is one reason the Minoan civilization feels both present and absent. Its traces are everywhere in the Bronze Age Aegean, but its independent voice becomes harder to hear. The breaking of tradition also changes how future generations remember. If stories are not written down in a readable form, if institutions collapse or are replaced, if survivors merge into new communities, then memory becomes scattered. What once belonged to living practice becomes an archaeological pattern. What once had names becomes a style. What once had voices becomes clay, pigment, stone, and silence. After Thera, the Minoan world did not vanish like a flame blown out in a single breath. It seems to have dimmed through the gradual loss of continuity, leaving behind enough evidence to show that something endured, but not enough to let us hear clearly what that endurance meant. The most difficult losses in ancient history are often not the buildings that fall, but the words that no longer exist. Stone can remain for thousands of years. Pottery can survive in broken pieces. Ash can preserve the shape of a room long after the people have gone. But speech disappears almost instantly unless it is carried into memory, and memory disappears unless it is repeated or written in a form that later people can understand. In the Minoan world, this loss is central to the mystery of what came after. The civilization left signs of administration, trade, craft, and belief, yet the inner language of that world remains largely unreachable because its main early script, known today as Linear A, has not been securely deciphered. The marks exist, but their full voice is still closed. This silence changes everything. If we could read Minoan records clearly, the aftermath of Thera might look very different. We might know more about names of places, movements of goods, offices of authority, offerings, shortages, repairs, or changes in control. We might see whether communities recorded damage, relocation, or rebuilding. We might learn whether the eruption was remembered in practical records, ritual language, or not at all. Instead, researchers must work mostly from physical traces. They can study destroyed buildings, ash layers, storage jars, imported objects, and later administrative tablets, but they cannot listen directly to the older Minoan explanation of its own crisis. That gap is not small. It is the difference between observing a footprint and hearing the traveller describe the journey. Human beings have always depended on shared words to carry meaning across time. Long before formal writing, early communities preserved knowledge through speech, gesture, imitation, and repeated practice. A route to water, a warning about a dangerous place, a method for shaping a tool, a story explaining the landscape, all could survive if one generation told the next. Writing later made memory more durable, but only when the signs could be preserved and read. A written tablet that cannot be understood becomes a quiet object, no longer a living message. In the case of the Minoans, the undeciphered script leaves us standing close to their world while still unable to enter it fully. The later appearance of Linear B on Crete adds another layer to the loss. Linear B can be read, and it records an early form of Greek associated with Mycenaean administration. Its presence shows that later systems of control and accounting became important on the island. But Linear B does not restore the older Minoan voice. It tells us about a changed world, one in which mainland influence had become stronger. The records that survive from this later phase may illuminate administration, but they also remind us that a shift had already occurred. The language of power had changed. The older system had either faded, been replaced, or survived only outside the official records that reached us. This is how a civilization can become historically quiet without becoming physically absent. People may still live in the houses, fields may still be worked, skills may still pass from parent to child, but if the records that once carried official memory vanish, and if the language behind them can no longer be heard, the society becomes harder for the future to recognize. Its continuity may persist in hands, habits, songs, and local practices, yet those forms rarely survive with names attached. For historians, this creates a deep uncertainty. What came after Thera was not only shaped by damaged harbours and shifting power, it was shaped by the disappearance of readable memory. The lost texts of the Minoan world are not just missing information, they are missing bridges between disaster and aftermath. Without them, we can see that something changed, but the people who lived through the change remain mostly silent, as if history kept their objects while letting their explanations fall away. When history becomes a silence, it does not mean that nothing happened. It means that something happened without leaving enough words for later generations to follow it clearly. This is the condition surrounding the Minoan world after Thera. The eruption was loud in geological terms. It left ash, buried streets, altered landscapes, and traces that scientists can still study. But the human aftermath became quiet. The people who lived through the disruption did not leave a readable account telling us how they understood the disaster, where survivors went, how communities reorganized, or what memories were carried into later generations. Instead, the story reaches us through fragments. A changed script, a damaged coast, a surviving building, a new administrative system, a style that continues in altered form. These fragments suggest movement, survival, and transformation, but they do not speak with a single voice. This silence is not unique to the Minoans. It belongs to much of human history. For most of our species' existence, people lived without writing, and even after writing appeared, many societies wrote on materials that did not survive, or in languages that later people could not read. The earliest humans passed knowledge through memory, gesture, imitation, and repeated practice. They understood landscapes, animals, seasons, tools, and dangers through shared experience, not through books. Their worlds were rich, but most of their voices vanished. The Minoans lived in a much later and more complex age, yet they still share part of that ancient human fate. They left enough behind to show that they mattered, but not enough to explain themselves fully. This is why the period after the eruption feels so difficult to name. If a civilization is known mainly through its buildings and objects, then changes in those objects can look like the disappearance of a people. But people are not the same as artifacts. A pot changes style. A palace changes administration. A script disappears. Yet families may continue to live, speak, remember, and adapt in ways that leave few visible traces. The silence of history can therefore hide continuity as easily as it hides collapse. On Crete, the older Minoan world did not vanish into empty space. It seems to have passed into a changed landscape, where Mycenaean influence grew stronger and earlier traditions survived unevenly. Some memories may have remained in local practice long after official systems changed. Some stories may have been retold until their origins became unrecognizable. Some skills may have continued without carrying the old name of the civilization that shaped them. The hardest loss is that we cannot separate these threads with certainty. We can describe the broad transformation, but not every human path within it. Archaeology can tell us that a room was used, that a jar stored goods, that a tablet recorded administration, or that a settlement changed over time. It cannot always tell us what a mother told her child after the ash fell, what a sailor remembered about a vanished harbour, or whether an old ritual still felt the same after new powers arrived. Those questions may be beyond recovery, yet their absence should make the story more careful, not less meaningful. The silence reminds us that ancient civilizations were lived by real human beings before they became categories in modern history. By the time later Aegean societies rose into clearer view, the Minoan world had become both inheritance and mystery. Its art, architecture, symbols, and maritime memory did not disappear completely. But the living centre that had once held them together had become difficult to hear. History had not stopped. It had simply moved beyond the range of the voices we can still understand, leaving behind a quiet space where the question of what came after remains open. When later Greek civilization becomes clearer in the historical record, the Minoan world is already partly hidden behind layers of change. The old centres of Crete no longer stand at the same height of power. Mycenaean influence has grown. New forms of administration have appeared. The Aegean is moving toward another age, one that will eventually leave behind its own ruins, poems, myths, and memories. Yet the older civilization does not vanish completely from the world that follows. Its traces remain like quiet shapes beneath later history, visible in art, architecture, religious imagery, maritime habits, and perhaps in stories whose earliest forms can no longer be separated from later retelling. This is one of the most delicate questions in the whole narrative. What survives when a civilization loses its central voice? The answer is rarely simple. Some things survive as objects, some survive as techniques, some survive as places that remained sacred or meaningful, some survive only as influence absorbed so deeply into later culture that the original source becomes difficult to identify. In the case of Crete, later Greek tradition remembered the island in powerful ways. Stories connected it with kings, labyrinths, bulls, sea power, and ancient mysteries. These stories cannot be used as direct historical records of the Bronze Age. They were shaped by generations of oral transmission, poetic imagination, political memory, and cultural change. Yet they may still preserve a distant awareness that Crete once mattered greatly. Myths are not the same as archaeology, but they sometimes form around real landscapes, old ruins, and inherited memories whose original meanings have faded. The material record also shows that Minoan influence continued to shape the Aegean world. Artistic motifs associated with Crete appear beyond the island. Certain forms of imagery, decoration, and craftsmanship travelled through networks of contact. Mycenaean culture absorbed and adapted elements that had earlier been linked to Minoan taste and technique. This was not simple copying. Human cultures rarely borrow without changing what they receive. Since the earliest communities of our species, knowledge has moved from group to group through contact, imitation, adaptation, and reinvention. A tool form might spread and be altered, a story might travel and gain new meaning, a ritual symbol might be preserved while its explanation changes. The Minoan legacy followed this broader human pattern. It entered later worlds not as a preserved museum of the past, but as living material reshaped by new hands. Crete itself remained important. Its landscapes, ruins, and memories continued to influence how later people understood the island. The old palatial centres became part of a deeper past that later generations could sense but not fully explain. A broken wall can outlive the language of its builders. A painted symbol can survive after the beliefs around it have changed. A harbour can remain useful after the power that once controlled it has faded. In this way, the Minoan world became both foundation and mystery. It contributed to the cultural environment from which later Greek civilization emerged, yet it did so without leaving a clear narrative of its own passage into that future. This is why the question of what came after cannot be answered only by naming the Mycenaeans or pointing to later Greece. What came after was also inheritance. It was the survival of forms without full explanations, the continuation of memory without a readable voice, and the transformation of a maritime civilization into traces scattered through the culture that followed. The people who came later did not walk into an empty Aegean. They walked through a landscape already shaped by centuries of Minoan life, where the old world remained present, not as a living empire, but as a quiet influence beneath the surface of Greek history. The Minoan story teaches a quiet lesson about civilization. A society can become skilled, wealthy, artistic, connected, and deeply rooted in its landscape, yet still remain vulnerable to forces larger than itself. This does not make its achievements smaller. It makes them more human. The people of Crete built complex centres, crossed dangerous seas, stored harvests, created images of striking beauty, and developed systems that tied many communities together. They were not passive figures waiting for disaster. They were active builders of a world that had taken centuries to form. Yet the eruption of Thera reminds us that even the strongest human systems exist inside environments they do not fully control. Beneath the sea routes, beneath the harbours, beneath the familiar island horizons, geological forces were moving on a scale older than any civilization. This is one of the oldest truths in the human story. From the beginning, our species has lived by adaptation rather than control. Early humans survived because they could notice patterns, cooperate, remember, move, and teach. They did not command the climate, the animals, the rivers, or the changing land. They learned to live with uncertainty. Later civilizations expanded that ability. Agriculture stored food against difficult seasons. Trade carried goods across distance. Writing preserved memory beyond the human voice. Architecture created places meant to last. But none of these achievements removed the deeper condition of human life. We remain creatures of the earth, dependent on weather, water, soil, movement, and the stability of landscapes that can change without asking permission from the societies built upon them. The Minoans show how prosperity can create both strength and fragility. Their maritime networks made them influential. The sea allowed goods, ideas, and people to move between Crete and distant shores. That connection supported growth, but the same connection may have carried disruption when disaster struck. A damaged harbour, an interrupted route, a weakened trading partner, or a frightened population could affect places far from the volcano itself. This pattern is not limited to the Bronze Age. Human beings have always built networks to survive better, and those networks have always carried risk as well as benefit. The more connected a world becomes, the more carefully it must understand the systems that sustain it. There is also a lesson about memory. The Minoans did not disappear from the ground. Their stones, paintings, jars, scripts, and ruins remain. Yet because their older voice is largely unreadable, their history reaches us in fragments. This reminds us that memory is not guaranteed by greatness. A society may create beauty in complexity, but if its records are lost, if its language cannot be read, or if later generations reshape its symbols, then much of its inner life can fade. What remains may be enough to prove that it existed, but not enough to let it explain itself. For the listener, this is not only a lesson about a distant civilization, it is a lesson about humility. Human history is not a straight road of simple progress. It is a long movement through uncertainty, where knowledge grows slowly, where communities adapt imperfectly, and where survival often depends on what can be carried across disruption. The Minoan world after Thera asks us to look at civilization not as something permanent, but as something living, built by generations, protected by memory, exposed to nature, and always changing. Its ruins do not only tell us that a disaster happened, they tell us that what humans build matters precisely because it can be lost. The story ends where it began, with silence. Around 1600 BC, a powerful eruption reshaped Thera, buried Akrotiri, disturbed the Aegean world, and left Crete facing pressures that no single explanation can fully contain. Yet the deeper mystery is not only the violence of the disaster, it is the quiet uncertainty that followed. Some people may have escaped, some communities on Crete continued, some traditions endured, some systems weakened. Mycenaean influence grew, older Minoan voices faded. Out of these fragments came a world that was not empty, but also not the same. This is why the question of what came after remains so difficult. History often survives as a shoreline after a storm, with some stones still visible and others pulled beneath the water. We can trace the outline, but not every lost path. The Minoans remind us that a civilization is more than its ruins. It is the living connection between generations. It is the memory carried by parents to children, by teachers to apprentices, by sailors to younger sailors, by farmers to those who learn the soil. Since the earliest beginnings of our species, human beings have survived by passing knowledge forward. Long before cities, long before writing, long before ships crossed the Aegean, people endured because memory could outlive one lifetime. Yet memory is fragile. It can be broken by migration, disaster, conquest, language change, or the simple passage of time. When memory breaks, the people may still leave objects behind, but the meaning of those objects begins to drift away from us. This may be the quietest loss in the Minoan story, not that everything vanished, but that enough was lost to make the surviving world difficult to hear. Akrotiri remains beneath ash. Crete remains in stone, paint and clay. Linear A remains in signs we cannot yet read with certainty. Later Greek tradition remembers Crete through stories of kings, bulls, labyrinths and sea power, but these memories arrive changed, shaped by later voices and later needs. Somewhere between the ash-covered houses and the later myths lies the human aftermath we cannot fully recover. There may have been grief, there may have been rebuilding, there may have been families who carried memories of lost harbours and changed coastlines into new homes. But responsible history cannot claim what the evidence does not allow. It can only stand before the remains and speak carefully. That carefulness is not weakness. It is respect for the dead, for the living, and for the truth. The value of this story is not that it gives us a perfect answer. Its value is that it teaches us how to live with an incomplete one. Civilizations are not permanent monuments outside nature. They are human arrangements built inside time. They depend on soil, water, weather, trade, trust, language, memory, and the steady work of ordinary lives. When those connections are disturbed, what follows may not look like an instant ending. It may look like adaptation, survival, blending, forgetting, and slow transformation. The Minoan world was buried in places, continued in places, and changed in ways that future generations still struggle to name. Perhaps that is the most honest answer to the title. Something came after, but it did not come after as a clean replacement or a clear continuation. It came as a changed world carrying broken pieces of the old one. And as we look back across the ash, the sea, and the long silence of unread words, one final question remains. How many other human worlds have not truly disappeared, but only become too quiet for history to hear?